What if there's an advanced alien race watching humanity from another galaxy, right now? The Andromedans are believed by some to originate from the Andromeda Galaxy, described as highly intelligent beings with advanced technology and a deep understanding of the universe. Unlike other alien theories, the Andromedans are often said to have a specific agenda, one that may involve observing, guiding, or even influencing human development. But where did these claims come from, and why do they keep appearing in UFO and extraterrestrial discussions? In this video, we explore the origins, the agenda, and the hidden mysteries behind the Andromedans' alien race. There is a question so ancient it predates civilization itself, carved not into stone, but into the marrow of human consciousness. It surfaces in the nighttime fears of children who stare at the ceiling and wonder what lives beyond the dark. It rises again in the minds of philosophers, scientists, theologians, and soldiers in moments of quiet when the noise of ordinary life finally falls away. It has never been answered to the satisfaction of the species that asks it, and yet humanity has never stopped asking, are we alone? Most people assume that question belongs to modern science, that it emerged from the lens of a telescope or the calculations of an astrophysicist, but the evidence suggests otherwise. The question is far older than any institution, any religion, any government. And buried deep within the oldest traditions of humanity, there are answers, or at least suggestions of answers, that point not outward into an empty void, but towards specific places, specific beings, and a relationship between those beings and the human species that stretches back across unimaginable stretches of time. The traditions of dozens of cultures, separated by oceans and millennia, converge on a single extraordinary claim that we were visited, that we were taught, and that the teachers came from the stars. Among the most persistent and specific of those traditions is one that has recently attracted serious attention from researchers working outside mainstream academia, from experiencers who have reported direct contact, from whistleblowers who have come forward with classified testimony, and from independent investigators who have spent decades cross-referencing ancient texts, modern encounters, and suppressed scientific literature. That tradition speaks of a race of beings that does not originate in our solar system or even in our galaxy. It speaks of a people who call themselves, in the translated interpretations of those who have communicated with them, the Andromedans, beings who trace their origins to the Andromeda Galaxy, the vast spiral structure 2.5 million light-years from our own Milky Way, the nearest large galactic neighbor we have, and by some accounts, the most important. To understand why this claim matters and why it has persisted across such a wide body of testimony and ancient record, we have to begin at the beginning. Not the beginning of the story, as modern researchers tell it, but the beginning as the Andromedans themselves apparently describe it, because they do not describe themselves as alien in the way science fiction has trained us to use that word. They describe themselves as something far stranger, far more philosophically challenging, and far more relevant to the human story than any Hollywood version of First Contact has prepared us to consider. They describe themselves as us, not us in the sense of humans who left Earth, not descendants of some lost civilization that colonized another galaxy, but us in a deeper, more fundamental sense, in a sense that touches the nature of consciousness, time, and the relationship between biological life and the vast architecture of the cosmos. The implications of that claim are so profound that most researchers who encounter it for the first time struggle to frame it within any existing philosophical or scientific model. It does not fit neatly into materialism. It does not fit neatly into religion. It exists in a conceptual space that humanity is, perhaps for the first time in its modern history, slowly beginning to develop the language to describe. But before we explore what the Andromedans say about their nature and their relationship to humanity, we have to understand what they say about where they come from, because the Andromeda Galaxy is not simply a backdrop. It is, according to their testimony as relayed through multiple independent contact sources, a place with its own history, its own civilizations, its own wars and periods of peace, its own mysteries. It is, in the deepest possible sense, a world unto itself. And the beings who emerged from it and eventually found their way to our corner of the universe did not arrive by accident. They arrived with intention. They arrived with knowledge, and they arrived, according to the most consistent versions of the contact accounts, with a warning. The Andromeda Galaxy, designated Messier 31 by modern astronomers, is the largest structure in what is known as the Local Group, the gravitational family of galaxies to which our Milky Way belongs. It contains approximately 1 trillion stars, roughly twice the number estimated to exist in our own galaxy. It spans 220,000 light-years in diameter. It is approaching our galaxy at a speed of approximately 110 kilometers per second. And in roughly 4.5 billion years, it will collide and merge with the Milky Way in a slow, 100 million year long cosmic dance. Modern astronomy knows these facts. What modern astronomy does not officially acknowledge is that this approaching galaxy may have been sending its inhabitants in our direction long before the collision is scheduled to begin. The earliest human records that researchers believe reference Andromedan contact are not from the modern era. They are not from the 20th century UFO wave, not from the Cold War period, not even from the Renaissance or the ancient classical world. The most archaic references appear to come from traditions so old they predate writing itself, preserved only in oral form and later transcribed by civilizations that had already lost the direct understanding of what the stories meant. In the Vedic traditions of ancient India, there are references to beings who came from what the texts describe as the realm beyond the river of stars, a description that some researchers have interpreted as a metaphorical designation for the space beyond the Milky Way itself. These beings are described not as gods in the omnipotent supernatural sense, but as teachers, as observers, as advisors who came with specific knowledge and specific limitations. They could not simply fix humanity's problems. They could only offer information, perspective, and occasional direct intervention when certain conditions were met. In the traditions of certain West African cultures, particularly those of the Dogon people of Mali, researchers have long noted an extraordinary astronomical knowledge that should, by all conventional logic, have been impossible to acquire without telescopic equipment that the Dogon did not possess. Their cosmological maps describe the Sirius star system with a precision that was not confirmed by Western science until the 20th century. But the Dogon also speak of other visitors, beings they associate not with Sirius, but with what their tradition calls the deep void, the emptiness between the great river of stars and the even greater river beyond it. The description is remarkably consistent with the space between the Milky Way and Andromeda. These beings, in Dogon tradition, are associated with the concept of refinement, with the idea of consciousness that has moved through many forms and arrived at something approaching its final expression. In the ancient traditions of Mesoamerica, among both the Maya and the earlier Olmec cultures that influenced them, there are accounts of celestial visitors who came not from within the familiar patterns of stars that the Maya mapped with such extraordinary precision, but from beyond the edge of the known sky. The Maya concept of the cosmos did not end at the visible stars. It extended into layers and dimensions that their astronomical and spiritual traditions described in elaborate detail. And within those outer layers, there are described intelligences of a specific character, beings associated with time, with the nature of cycles, with the deep structure of reality beneath what the physical senses can perceive. The Maya calendar systems, some of the most sophisticated chronological tools ever developed by any human civilization, were not, according to the Maya themselves, human inventions. They were gifts, transmitted from minds that perceived time differently than humans do. The convergence of these traditions across cultures that had no known contact with one another points to something. It does not prove extraterrestrial visitation in the scientific sense, because ancient traditions, by their nature, do not constitute scientific evidence, but they do establish a pattern. And when that pattern is placed alongside the modern contact testimony of researchers like Alex Collier, whose claims about direct communication with Andromedan beings became one of the most detailed and internally consistent bodies of alleged contact literature in the modern era, something interesting happens. The ancient and the modern begin to rhyme. The details align in ways that are difficult to attribute entirely to coincidence or cultural contamination. Alex Collier is a name that any serious researcher of this subject cannot ignore, and also cannot uncritically accept. His testimony, which he began sharing publicly in the 1990s, describes a lifetime of contact with beings he identifies as Andromedans, specifically from a star system he calls Zenitai, a binary star system within what we would recognize as the Andromeda Galaxy. Collier claims his contacts began in childhood and continued through his adult life, and that the beings he communicated with, whom he describes as physically similar to humans, but with notable differences in skin tone, skeletal structure, and energetic presence, provided him with extensive information about the history of the universe, the nature of consciousness, the history of the Earth, and the current situation facing humanity. What makes Collier's testimony unusual, and the reason serious researchers have continued to engage with it despite the obvious impossibility of verification, is its internal consistency over decades. Unlike many contact claims that shift or expand in suspicious ways as the claimant grows a following, Collier's core claims have remained remarkably stable. The details he provided in the 1990s have not dramatically changed or inflated in the decades since. Some of those details have also, with time, intersected with information that has emerged from other independent sources, including declassified government documents, the testimony of other self-described experiencers, and the claims of insiders from various intelligence and military communities who have come forward under varying degrees of anonymity. Collier describes his primary contacts as two beings he refers to by the names Morane and Visayas, names that represent his phonetic attempts to render sounds that he describes as existing somewhat outside the normal range of human hearing. Visayas, the elder of the two in Collier's account, is described as extraordinarily ancient, even by the standards of his own civilization, a being whose age Collier has at various times described as equivalent to several 100 million years of accumulated consciousness. This claim alone places the testimony in a conceptual category that challenges most human philosophical frameworks simultaneously. A being of several 100 million years of accumulated consciousness does not experience time, history, memory, or identity in any way that the human mind can directly access. The gap between such an existence and the 70 or 80 years of biological life that constitutes a human lifetime is so vast that it effectively renders direct understanding impossible. This is, according to Collier's accounts of his contacts' own explanations, precisely why they do not communicate in the direct information transfer mode that humans might expect. They cannot simply download their understanding into a human mind. The receiving apparatus is not built for it. Instead, they communicate through what Collier describes as a kind of conceptual seeding, presenting ideas and images and feelings in ways that the human mind can process at its own level, then gradually expanding the bandwidth of that communication as the relationship deepens and the human nervous system adapts. This description of the contact methodology is itself one of the reasons researchers find Collier's account interesting. It does not describe an omnipotent alien race simply transmitting information to a passive human receiver. It describes a relationship, a process, a kind of collaborative translation across an almost incomprehensible cognitive gap. It is more consistent with what cognitive scientists might predict about interspecies or interdimensional communication than it is with the simplistic models most contact narratives present. The origins that the Andromedans describe for themselves, as relayed through Collier and corroborated in various ways by other contact sources, do not begin in the Andromeda Galaxy in the way that we might imagine a human civilization beginning on a specific planet. They do not describe a homeworld in the conventional sense. What they describe is something more like a cosmic heritage, a lineage that predates the formation of the Andromeda Galaxy itself, and that has passed through multiple forms, multiple dimensions of existence, and multiple civilizations across timescales that stretch into what they call the deep past, a period so remote that even their own historical records do not extend to it in linear form. They describe their earliest ancestral consciousness as having originated in what they call the first creation, a period that they associate with the initial differentiation of universal consciousness into individual awareness. This is not a scientific claim in the empirical sense. It is a cosmological claim, a description of the structure of existence from the perspective of beings who claim to have access to historical records and experiential memories that extend back much further than any human civilization's written history. Whether one takes this as literal truth, as metaphor, or as the projection of a non-human intelligence onto human conceptual frameworks, it is a claim that fundamentally distinguishes the Andromedan tradition from most other alleged contact narratives. Most alien contact stories describe beings from other planets, beings who evolved, as life does on Earth, from simpler to more complex biological forms over millions of years of natural selection. The Andromedan account describes something categorically different, beings whose identity is fundamentally rooted not in biology, not in a planet or a solar system, but in consciousness itself. Biology, in their framework, is something that consciousness wears, rather than something that produces consciousness. This inversion of the materialist assumption is one of the most consistent and challenging aspects of the Andromedan tradition, and it is the key to understanding everything else they apparently say about themselves, about humanity, and about the purpose of their presence in our world. The physical form that the Andromedans are described as taking in the most detailed contact accounts is humanoid. This is a fact that immediately raises skeptical eyebrows because the overwhelming dominance of humanoid form in contact narratives has long been cited as evidence that these narratives are cultural projections rather than genuine accounts of alien encounters. If there are truly intelligent beings in other galaxies, the argument goes, the probability of them being physically similar to humans is essentially zero. Evolution on a different world under different conditions would produce forms radically unlike anything that has emerged on Earth. This is a sound argument, and the Andromedan tradition does not dismiss it. It engages with it. The explanation offered, through Collier and other sources, is that humanoid form is not an accident of a single planet's evolutionary history. It is, in the Andromedan account, a template, a pattern that recurs across the universe because it represents a particularly effective configuration of biological hardware for the kind of consciousness that chooses to incarnate in physical form. The specific proportions of the humanoid body, the positioning of sensory organs, the relationship between the brain and the rest of the nervous system, these are not accidental. They are, in the Andromedan framework, the product of what they call intentional seeding, a deliberate propagation of biological templates across multiple galaxies by civilizations so ancient that our own most ancient ancestors would seem to them like newborns taking their first steps. This concept of intentional seeding is one of the most important and controversial elements of the Andromedan tradition, and it will recur throughout this exploration in multiple contexts. For now, it is enough to note that it provides the framework within which the Andromedans explain the physical similarity between themselves and humans, and within which they explain humanity's place in a very much larger and more complex cosmic story than the one that mainstream science has so far been willing to tell. By the time this first part of our exploration concludes, we have only scratched the surface of what the Andromedan tradition claims to contain. We have established that there are ancient records across multiple unconnected cultures pointing toward contact with beings from beyond our galaxy. We have introduced the modern contact tradition, particularly the testimony of Alex Collier, as the most detailed contemporary source of Andromedan-related claims. We have noted that the Andromedans do not describe themselves in the simple terms of science fiction extraterrestrials, but as beings whose identity is rooted in consciousness rather than biology, and we have introduced the concept of intentional seeding as the framework they use to explain the presence of humanoid life across the universe. What we have not yet explored is what the Andromedans say about the specific history of humanity about how our species came to exist in its current form, about the interventions and manipulations that they claim have shaped human civilization over the past several 100,000 years, and about the forces that they describe as operating against humanity's best interests in the present moment. Those claims form the heart of the Andromedan tradition, and they are simultaneously the most compelling and the most difficult to evaluate. They point toward a history of our species that is radically different from any version currently taught in schools or endorsed by mainstream science. They point toward powers and agendas that operate in the shadows of human civilization, with a sophistication and a time horizon that dwarfs anything that human geopolitics has yet produced. And they point, ultimately, toward a future that the Andromedans describe not with despair, but with something remarkably close to hope. A future in which the human species has the potential to complete a transformation that has been in progress for much longer than any of us have been alive. A transformation that represents, in their account, one of the most significant developments in the history of this region of the universe. Understanding that claim requires understanding the full scope of what the Andromedans say they know about us and why they apparently care enough about our fate to have maintained a presence in our world across the full span of recorded human history and well beyond it. That is the story we are here to tell. The Andromedan Galaxy, cradle of a civilization. When modern astronomers speak of the Andromeda Galaxy, they speak in the language of measurements and probabilities. They discuss its diameter, its mass, its distance, its rate of approach. They map its spiral arms with radio telescopes, catalog its estimated 1 trillion stars, and calculate the gravitational dynamics that will eventually pull it into collision with our own Milky Way. What they do not discuss, because the professional culture of modern astronomy does not permit it, is the possibility that this vast structure, this city of stars twice the size of our own galactic home, might be inhabited. Not just inhabited in the diffuse probabilistic sense that statisticians invoke when they calculate the odds of life somewhere in the universe, but inhabited by a civilization, or multiple civilizations, of a sophistication so far beyond anything that has emerged on Earth that the comparison becomes almost meaningless. The Andromedan contact tradition makes exactly this claim, and it makes it with a specificity that goes well beyond the vague assertions most contact narratives offer. It names star systems. It describes the characteristics of specific inhabited worlds. It provides details about the political structure of civilizations that extend across multiple solar systems within the Andromeda Galaxy. And it describes the history of those civilizations in ways that have both internal logical consistency and, in some cases, suggestive parallels with what modern astrophysics knows or suspects about the Andromeda Galaxy's physical history. According to the information relayed through Alex Collier and other contact sources, the Andromeda Galaxy is home to what can be loosely described as a confederation of civilizations, a loose but real association of inhabited star systems that maintains communication, trade of a non-material kind, and collective governance through what is described as a council structure. This confederation is not a single unified government in the way that most humans would understand that term. It does not have a capital planet or a central administration in any simple sense. It is better described as a network of relationships maintained across vast distances through technologies and communication methods that have no equivalence in human science, at least not in any science that is publicly known. The specific home system of the beings who identify themselves as Andromedans in the contact literature is described in Collier's accounts as the Zenithal system, a binary star system within the Andromeda Galaxy. Collier describes the inhabited world within this system as a place of extraordinary environmental beauty, a world that he says his contacts described with what he interpreted as genuine affection, the kind of attachment that any being might feel toward the place of their origin. The world itself is described as significantly older than Earth, having had a stable biosphere for a period that, in the timeline the Andromedans provide, extends back many hundreds of millions of years, far longer than the roughly 4 billion years of Earth's own biological history. This age matters for reasons that go beyond simple chronology. A biosphere that has been stable for hundreds of millions of years produces, through the evolutionary processes that all life appears to share, an ecological complexity and interconnectedness that Earth's relatively young and repeatedly disrupted biosphere has not yet had time to achieve. The Andromedans describe their homeworld as a place of extraordinary biological density, where the relationships between organisms, between the organic and inorganic, between the physical and what they call the energetic substrate, have developed over such immense timescales that the biosphere itself functions as something approaching a single conscious entity. This concept, which will be familiar to those who have encountered James Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis or similar ideas in earth science, is taken much further in the Andromedan account. The biosphere of their world is not simply a self-regulating system in the mechanistic sense that Lovelock described. It is, in their account, genuinely aware, not in the diffuse metaphorical sense, but in a sense that they describe as fundamental to their understanding of what life is and what it is for. This understanding of life as inherently conscious, as something that consciousness does, rather than something that produces consciousness as a byproduct, is the foundation of everything the Andromedans describe about their civilization, their history, and their relationship to the rest of the universe. It is the lens through which they interpret physics, biology, history, politics, and what we would call spirituality. For them, these are not separate domains of knowledge. They are aspects of a single understanding of the nature of reality. And the integration of that understanding across all of these domains is precisely what they mean when they describe their civilization as advanced. Not technologically advanced in the limited sense that humans typically mean, though they are that as well, but advanced in a deeper sense that has to do with the coherence and completeness of their understanding of what exists and how it works. The political history of the Andromedan civilization, as the Andromedans describe it through their contact witnesses, is not a simple story of continuous progress. It is a history that includes periods of conflict, of failure, of civilizational catastrophe, and of recovery. This is one of the aspects of the Andromedan tradition that many researchers find most credible, not because they can verify the specific historical claims, but because it accords with what one might expect from any civilization that has existed long enough to accumulate genuine wisdom. Wisdom, the kind that translates into constructive action across vast time frames and complex situations, is not acquired through a history of uninterrupted success. It is forged through experience with failure, through the hard lessons that only genuine catastrophe can teach. The Andromedans describe a period in the early history of their civilization that they associate with what we might call technological adolescence, a period during which their scientific understanding had advanced significantly beyond their ethical development, producing a dangerous imbalance. This is a theme that will recur when we examine what they say about Earth's current situation, and the parallel is not incidental. The Andromedans describe having made, in this earlier period of their history, mistakes whose consequences took a very long time to repair. They describe having developed technologies capable of affecting matter and energy at scales that their civilization was not yet wise enough to use responsibly. The results, as they describe them, were not simply local disasters. They were disruptions that affected the broader region of the Andromeda Galaxy in ways that are still, by their account, reverberating through time. The concept of temporal reverberations is one of the more challenging aspects of the Andromedan cosmological framework, and it requires a brief digression into what they appear to mean by it. The Andromeda tradition does not treat time as the simple one-directional flow that human experience suggests. Time, in their framework, is a dimension that can be affected, manipulated, and damaged in ways broadly analogous to how physical space can be affected, manipulated, and damaged. An event of sufficient energy and wrongness, in the moral as well as the physical sense, can create what they call a time distortion, a kind of scar in the fabric of temporal reality that causes events in its vicinity to unfold differently than they otherwise would have. This is not presented as a metaphor. It is presented as a straightforward description of how time actually behaves at scales and energies far beyond what human science has yet accessed. The implications of this framework for the history of the Andromedan civilization are significant. It means that the mistakes of their distant past did not simply play out and then end. They created ongoing distortions that subsequent generations had to consciously identify and work to repair. The process of repairing these temporal distortions is, according to the Andromedan account, one of the driving purposes of their civilization's activity in our region of the universe, and one of the reasons they are here. Not the only reason, but a significant one, and one that contextualizes much of what they apparently do and why they apparently do it in ways that are easy to misinterpret without this background. The Andromedan Confederation, as it is described in the contact literature, is not a single monolithic civilization. It is a collection of civilizations at various stages of development, held together not by force or economic dependency, but by what the Andromedans describe as a shared understanding of consciousness and its relationship to physical reality. The entry requirements for participation in this confederation are not technological. They are not based on achieving a certain level of scientific or industrial capacity. They are based on what the Andromedans describe as a minimum threshold of ethical coherence, a minimum level of collective understanding about the nature of consciousness and the responsibilities that come with self-awareness. A civilization that has not reached this threshold is not eligible for Confederation membership, not because it is excluded by force, but because it does not yet have the conceptual framework to engage meaningfully with the Confederation's core activities. This criterion has direct implications for humanity, as we will explore in detail later. For now, it is important to note that the Andromedan Confederation is described as an extraordinarily diverse assembly. It includes beings of different physical forms, different evolutionary histories, different relationships to biology and technology, different orientations toward what we might call spirituality. What they share is not a common culture or a common physical type, but a common framework of understanding about consciousness, reality, and responsibility. That shared framework is the glue that holds the Confederation together across the vast distances and profound differences that would otherwise make sustained civilization-to-civilization relationships essentially impossible. Within the Andromeda Galaxy, the Andromedans describe a complex political landscape that has shifted considerably over the timescales they discuss. They describe periods of greater unity, periods of conflict, periods of withdrawal and isolation by various member civilizations. They describe the existence of beings within the Andromeda Galaxy who are not members of the Confederation and who do not share its values, beings whose agendas and activities have been a source of conflict and difficulty throughout Andromedan history. This is an important point because it establishes that the Andromedans do not present themselves as representing a uniformly benevolent galactic civilization. They represent a specific tradition, a specific set of values within a much larger and more diverse reality that includes perspectives and agendas very different from their own. The physical description of the Andromeda Galaxy in Andromedan cosmology goes beyond what modern astronomy has mapped. They describe regions of the galaxy that, in their account, have been deliberately modified over vast timescales, not by technology in the simple sense of machines altering physical matter, but by the application of what they call conscious intention operating through what they describe as the energetic substrate, the non-physical foundation of physical reality. Modern physics, in its more speculative reaches, has concepts that rhyme with this: the zero-point field, dark energy, quantum vacuum fluctuations, the various candidate theories for what might lie beneath the observable structure of spacetime. The Andromedan account is not identical to any of these theories, but it is not entirely alien to the conceptual territory they inhabit. The Andromedans describe their civilization as having, over its long history, developed a detailed understanding of what they call the base creative energy of the universe, the fundamental substrate from which all physical phenomena emerge and into which they return. This understanding is not merely theoretical, it is applied. Their most advanced technologies, as they describe them, do not operate by manipulating matter and energy in the crude sense that human technology does. They operate by interfacing with this base creative energy, by modifying the templates that determine what physical reality looks like at the level of emergence. The results of this kind of technology are, from the perspective of a civilization that has not yet developed it, effectively indistinguishable from what we would call miraculous. A ship that can cross 2.5 million light-years of space does not do so by going faster than light in the conventional sense. Speed, as the Andromedans apparently describe it, is a concept that applies only within the physical universe as we experience it. Their method of traversing large distances does not involve accelerating through space at all. It involves changing the dimensional address of the ship and its contents, stepping outside the normal structure of physical space-time and re-entering it at a different location. This is closer to what theoretical physicists discuss when they talk about wormholes or fold space travel. But the mechanism the Andromedans describe is not primarily technological in the engineering sense. It is primarily conscious. The beings involved in the traversal are not simply passengers in a machine. They are active participants in the navigation process, and their understanding of the dimensional structure through which they move is as important to the journey's success as any hardware. This integration of consciousness and technology, the inability to cleanly separate what the machine does from what the mind of the operator contributes, is a recurring theme in everything the Andromedans describe about their civilization's capabilities. It is, again, one of the aspects of the tradition that researchers find most distinctive, because it is not the way human science fiction has generally imagined advanced technology. Human depictions of advanced alien spacecraft typically imagine the technology as the dominant factor and the crew as secondary. The Andromedan account inverts this. The consciousness of the crew, their coherence, their intention, their relationship to the space through which they move, these are primary. The technology is the enabling structure, but it is consciousness that drives it. The Andromedan descriptions of their home worlds, their civilizational structures, and their historical experiences are rich and detailed enough to fill volumes, and they have, through the various contact accounts and research syntheses that have accumulated over decades. What matters for our purposes is the overall picture they create, a civilization of extraordinary age and depth, shaped by a history that includes both great achievement and serious failure, holding a body of understanding about the nature of reality that is, in their own estimation, still incomplete, still evolving, still being refined by new experience and new encounter. They do not present themselves as perfect beings. They do not present themselves as gods or as beings beyond the reach of error. They present themselves as far along a path that they believe all consciousness is walking, a path toward greater understanding, greater coherence, greater capacity to act with wisdom and love in a universe whose full depth they have not yet plumbed. This humility, this refusal of omniscience, is one of the hallmarks of the Andromedan tradition as it comes through the most consistent contact accounts, and it is one of the qualities that makes those accounts interesting to people who approach this subject seriously. The Andromedan Galaxy, in their telling, is not just a star system. It is the home of a civilization whose story is deeply entangled with our own, across distances of space and time that the human mind can barely gesture toward. Understanding that story, in even partial form, is essential to understanding why the Andromedans are here, what they want, what they are concerned about, and what role they believe humanity is meant to play in the larger drama of consciousness in this universe. It is a story that is, by any measure, far from over. Physical reality, what the Andromedans look like and how they exist. The question of what the Andromedans look like is, in many ways, the most immediately fascinating and also the most misleading place to begin any serious investigation of this subject. It is the question that produces the most vivid imagery, the most dramatic claims, and also the most significant misunderstandings. Because the Andromedan tradition is ultimately about consciousness, not biology, and the physical form that Andromedan beings take is, in their own account, less fundamental to who they are than it would be for a human being, for whom the biological body is generally understood to be the primary locus of self. That said, the physical descriptions that emerge from the contact literature are specific, consistent, and in some ways, surprising. The Andromedans are not described as the large-headed gray beings that have become the dominant image of extraterrestrial life in popular culture. They are not reptilian, not insectoid, not radically non-humanoid. They are described as humanoid in the most basic sense, bipedal, bilaterally symmetrical, with sensory organs positioned in the general configuration of a human face, with 2 arms and 2 legs and a body plan that would not be immediately recognizable as radically alien if encountered at a distance. The differences become apparent on closer inspection. Andromedan beings are described across multiple contact accounts with a notable consistency as having a bluish-gray to blue-white skin tone, a coloration that sits outside the range of any human ethnic skin pigmentation. This is not described as a variable trait within their population in the way that human skin tones vary across individuals and populations. It is described as characteristic of their biological type, a product of the specific light environment of their home system's binary star configuration, and the evolutionary adaptations their biology has made over millions of years in that environment. Their eyes are described as larger in proportion to their faces than human eyes, set slightly further apart, and with a quality of depth that multiple contact witnesses have described in similar terms. The sense of looking into something that extends much further inward than a physical eye should. This quality has been interpreted by researchers in various ways. Some see it as a simple perceptual illusion arising from the contact witness's awe and excitement. Others interpret it more literally, as a description of eyes that interface differently with light and consciousness than human eyes do. Organs of perception that are attuned to ranges of information input that the standard human visual system does not access. The skeletal structure of Andromedan beings, as described in the contact literature, is subtly but significantly different from the human. They are described as generally taller than the average human, with some variation across individuals, typically in a range of 6 to 7 feet, though some contact accounts describe significantly larger individuals. Their bone structure is described as lighter and more porous than human bone, producing a skeleton that is strong but less dense, contributing to a physical grace and economy of movement that multiple witnesses have commented on. Their overall body mass is described as less than would be expected for a being of their height by human physiological standards, again consistent with a lighter skeletal structure and a musculature that appears to operate at a different efficiency level than human muscle. Their hands are described with particular consistency across contact accounts. Andromedan hands are described as having 4 fingers plus an opposable structure that corresponds to a thumb but proportioned differently than human hands, with longer, more flexible fingers that taper to pointed rather than rounded tips. The 4th finger is typically described as significantly longer relative to the others than is standard in human hand anatomy. These differences in hand structure are not incidental. The hands, in the Andromedan account, are not merely grasping tools. They are instruments of energy transmission, capable of channeling and directing what the Andromedans describe as life force or conscious energy in ways that have direct physical effects on biological systems and, in some circumstances, on physical matter. This energetic function of the hands is one of several physiological capabilities that the Andromedans are described as possessing, which have no direct equivalent in human biology, as mainstream science currently understands it. Another is what multiple contact witnesses describe as an ability to shift the density of their physical form, not disappearing or becoming transparent in the theatrical sense, but operating at a slightly different interface with physical matter, producing effects that witnesses describe variously as a shimmer, a translucency, or a sense of the being occupying the same space as physical objects without interacting with them in the normal way. Whether this is a biological capability, a technological one enabled by something they wear or carry, or a misinterpretation of something more mundane, is difficult to assess from the outside. The aging process for Andromedan beings, as described in the contact literature, is dramatically different from the human experience. They do not appear to age in the way that human biology ages, with a characteristic arc of growth, maturity, decline, and death. They maintain their physical form at what appears to be a relatively stable point for extremely long periods. When the Andromedans describe their own lifespans, the figures given are so large that they essentially lose meaning within any human frame of reference. Collier's contacts described lifespans measured in thousands of years in some cases, and in a few instances appeared to suggest that individual beings could maintain stable physical existence for much longer than that, though the distinction between the physical body and the consciousness that inhabits it becomes philosophically blurred at those timescales. What does seem clear from the most consistent contact accounts is that the Andromedan relationship to physical existence is fundamentally different from the human relationship to it. For humans, the physical body is experienced as the self, with consciousness understood either as a product of the body's biological processes or, in religious frameworks, as a soul temporarily inhabiting the body. The Andromedan account describes a relationship to the body that is more clearly in the second category, but in a much more literal and practical sense than most religious traditions intend. The Andromedan relationship to their physical form is described as genuinely voluntary in a way that human incarnation is not. They have, according to their own accounts, a degree of conscious control over the relationship between their consciousness and their physical vehicle that humans typically achieve only briefly and imperfectly in deep meditative states or near-death experiences. This degree of conscious control has practical implications for how they experience many of the things that are involuntary for humans. Pain, as they describe it, is an information signal rather than an overwhelming experience. They can register the information it carries without being dominated by the emergency response that human pain typically triggers. Disease, in the conventional biological sense, is described as essentially non-existent in their civilization, not because they have eliminated pathogens or developed pharmaceutical solutions, but because the integration of consciousness and biological function in their bodies operates at a level where disease, which is ultimately a disruption of biological order, cannot easily take hold. This is not magic. It is, in their account, the natural result of a civilization that has understood the relationship between consciousness and biology for long enough to develop that relationship to its full potential. Their sensory range extends beyond the human standard in several directions. They are described as perceiving portions of the electromagnetic spectrum that human eyes do not access, including what we would call near and far ultraviolet. They are described as having an acoustic range that extends into frequencies both above and below the range that human ears detect, with particular sensitivity in the infrasound range, the very low frequencies that human bodies sense rather than hear. Perhaps most significantly, they are described as having a form of direct energetic perception that has no clean equivalent in the standard human sensory palette, an ability to directly sense the life force or consciousness of other beings and physical systems in their environment, producing a kind of information about the world around them that is qualitatively different from what any of the 5 human senses provide. This last capability is, in the Andromedan account, one of the most important differences between their perceptual experience and the human standard. It is the primary basis for what we might call their empathic ability, their capacity to directly perceive the emotional and intentional state of other beings without the inferential process that humans use. Humans infer the emotional states of others from behavioral cues, facial expressions, body language, tone of voice, context. The Andromedans, as described in the contact literature, do not infer these states. They perceive them directly through this energetic sense, in the same way that humans perceive color through the visual system. It is not an interpretation, it is a direct datum of experience. The implications of this for their social organization and their political history are enormous. A civilization of beings who cannot conceal their genuine emotional and intentional state from one another has a very different relationship to deception, to privacy, to conflict, and to consensus than a civilization of beings like humans, who can, and regularly do, operate in ways that their internal states are completely invisible to others. The Andromedan civilization, as they describe it, evolved through a long historical period during which the refinement of this direct perceptual capacity was a central cultural preoccupation, and during which the social structures that developed were those that best served the needs of beings who could not easily hide from one another. This does not mean that their civilization is a perfect harmony. As already noted, they describe a history that includes conflict and catastrophe. Conflict among beings who can perceive each other's emotional states is not eliminated by that perception. It may in some ways be intensified because the stakes of a disagreement are more clearly felt by all parties. But the nature of conflict in such a civilization is different from conflict in human civilization. It tends not to be based on misunderstanding or deception, but on genuine differences in values and intention, which are in some ways more fundamental and more difficult to resolve than misunderstandings, but which also respond more readily to direct communication. The Andromedan diet and metabolism, to the extent that the contact literature addresses these mundane physiological details, are described as very different from the human. They are not described as carnivorous. The relationship between Andromedan consciousness and animal life makes the consumption of animal flesh a conceptual impossibility within their value system, not because of an ethical rule imposed from outside, but because their energetic perception of the consciousness present in animal life makes the act of killing that consciousness for food an experience that is directly and viscerally incompatible with their perceptual sensitivity. Some contact accounts describe a dietary basis, primarily in what we might call energetically refined plant substances, though there are suggestions that their relationship to physical nutrition has evolved over time to the point where direct nutritional intake, in the sense that humans understand it, plays a diminishing role in their biological maintenance. The reproductive biology of the Andromedans is a subject addressed only obliquely in most contact literature for reasons that are partly about the awkwardness of cross-species discussions of intimate biological processes and partly about the genuine philosophical complexity of reproduction in a civilization where the relationship between consciousness and biology is understood very differently than it is in human culture. What does emerge from the contact literature is that Andromedan reproduction is described as a far more consciously intentional process than human reproduction, involving a deliberate decision at the level of the individual consciousness to take on the responsibility of nurturing a new consciousness through the early stages of physical existence. The bringing forth of new life in Andromedan civilization is described as a significant event, celebrated and supported by the broader community, not because it is rare, but because it is understood as one of the most profound acts of creative engagement with the universe that consciousness can undertake. The emotional life of the Andromedans, as relayed through contact accounts, is not impoverished relative to the human. The idea that a highly advanced civilization must necessarily be cold, logical, and emotionally minimal is a persistent science fiction trope that the Andromedan tradition explicitly contradicts. What the contact accounts describe is not an absence of emotion, but a different relationship to emotion, one in which emotional experience is rich and full, but is not distorted by the fear-based amplification that characterizes much of human emotional life. Andromedan emotional experience is described as clear, as present, as fully felt, but without the turbulence and distortion that human emotional experience so often involves, without the unconscious reactions, the buried traumas, the self-deceptions that make human emotional life simultaneously so rich and so difficult. This clearer emotional experience is, in the Andromedan account, not a natural biological given. It is an achievement of their civilization's long development, both through the refinement of individual consciousness over long lifetimes and through the cultural practices and social structures that their civilization has developed over its history. They describe it as something that was earned through experience, including the difficult experience of civilizational periods when their emotional life was much more turbulent and their relationship to their own internal states much less clear. This is, again, one of the aspects of the tradition that researchers find most compelling, the self-aware acknowledgement of a developmental history that includes less evolved stages. The physical reality of Andromedan beings, then, is something that sits at the intersection of the biological and the conscious, the material and the energetic, in a way that does not map cleanly onto any purely materialist or purely spiritual framework that human civilization has developed. They have bodies. Those bodies have specific characteristics and capabilities, but those bodies are understood as vehicles of consciousness rather than sources of it, as expressions of an identity that extends beyond the physical in ways that are more than metaphorical. This dual nature, this genuine inhabitation of both the physical and the non-physical simultaneously, is perhaps the most important single characteristic of Andromedan existence, and it is the key to understanding both their capabilities and their values. The timeline of contact, from ancient Earth to the modern era. There is a temptation, when approaching the subject of Andromedan contact with Earth, to begin with the modern era, with the post-World War II UFO wave, with the Roswell incident, with the classified government programs that multiple insiders have described over the decades. The modern era offers the most detailed accounts, the most specific claims, the most technically verifiable assertions about dates and locations and physical events. It is natural to want to start there. But starting there is a mistake, because the Andromedan contact tradition does not describe an engagement with Earth that began in the 20th century. It describes an engagement that spans hundreds of thousands of years, a relationship so long and so layered with historical sediment that the 20th century developments, dramatic as they are, represent only the most recent chapter of a story that stretches back beyond the earliest records of human civilization. To understand why the Andromedans are engaged with Earth as they currently are, what they know about us, what they fear for us, what they hope for us, it is necessary to understand at least the broad outlines of what they apparently describe as the full arc of their relationship with this planet. The Andromedan account of Earth's deep history begins not with the emergence of Homo sapiens, but considerably earlier. They describe the Earth as a world that has been known to multiple galactic civilizations for a very long time, not simply as an unremarkable, inhabited planet in a minor solar system, but as a world of unusual significance within what they call the galactic community. That significance, in their account, is not primarily geological or astronomical. Though Earth does have certain physical characteristics that make it unusual, the significance is biological and energetic. Earth, as the Andromedans apparently describe it, is a world of extraordinary biological diversity and evolutionary creativity, a place where the processes of life have generated an exceptional range of forms and relationships over its history, and where the energetic conditions produced by that biodiversity create what they describe as a unique signature in what they call the fabric of consciousness that permeates all physical reality. In practical terms, what this means is that Earth has been, throughout its history, a point of interest and a point of competition for civilizations whose interests extend to the management and direction of consciousness in physical form. The phrase management and direction sounds sinister, and in some contexts, the Andromedan account does indeed describe sinister agendas directed at Earth's biological and conscious life. But it also describes agendas that are genuinely beneficial, orientations toward Earth's development that have been guided by care and wisdom. The history of extraterrestrial engagement with Earth, as the Andromedans tell it, is not a simple story of good forces and bad forces. It is a complex political and ethical history involving many different civilizations with many different interests, operating across timescales that make human political history look like a brief news item. The earliest intervention in Earth's biological history that the Andromedans specifically describe involves not humanity, but the broader arc of Earth's evolutionary development, the long process through which the planet's biosphere has been shaped, guided, and occasionally directly modified by civilizations with the understanding and the capability to do so. This concept, that Earth's evolutionary history is not entirely the product of random natural processes, but has been partially guided by intelligent intervention, is one of the most radical claims in the Andromedan tradition. It is also, in various forms, one of the most persistent themes in ancient traditions worldwide and in the testimony of multiple independent contact sources and alleged insiders. The Andromedans do not describe this guided evolution as a violation or an imposition. They describe it, in the most direct terms their contact witnesses have been able to convey, as a form of cultivation, comparable to the relationship between a gardener and a garden, but on a planetary scale and over geological timescales. The gardeners are not creating the garden from scratch. They are working with what the garden produces naturally, selecting, encouraging, occasionally introducing new elements, maintaining conditions that allow the most extraordinary forms of life to emerge and flourish. The purpose of this cultivation, in the Andromedan account, is not purely aesthetic or scientific. It is oriented toward a specific outcome: the emergence of a form of biological consciousness that is capable of serving as a bridge between the physical and the non-physical, between the material universe and the broader reality of consciousness from which the material universe emerges. This concept of humanity as a bridge consciousness is central to everything the Andromedans describe about their interest in us and their concern for our current situation. It explains why Earth has been a site of such sustained attention from galactic civilizations, and it explains why the various interventions and manipulations that the Andromedans describe, both benevolent and otherwise, have been focused specifically on shaping the nature and trajectory of human consciousness. If humanity's potential role in the larger cosmic story is as significant as the Andromedans claim, then the nature of human consciousness, its range, its depth, its relationship to both the physical and the non-physical, becomes a matter of genuine concern for any civilization that understands what is at stake. The Andromedan timeline of engagement with early humanity describes multiple distinct periods, each characterized by a different quality of relationship and a different set of interventions. The earliest period that they discuss in any detail involves what they describe as the initial seeding of humanoid consciousness on Earth, a process that did not involve the creation of the human biological form from scratch, but rather the installation of a specific quality of self-aware consciousness within the most developed primate form that Earth's natural evolution had produced at that time. The details of this process are described in ways that are reminiscent of, but not identical to, the creation narratives found in multiple ancient traditions worldwide, from the Sumerian Atrahasis to the biblical Genesis to the Hindu Puranas. The Andromedan account offers a behind-the-scenes perspective on what those traditions describe, providing a context that makes the stories comprehensible as partial records of real events rather than purely symbolic mythological constructions. The period that the Andromedans describe as following this initial consciousness seeding is one they associate with a long era of relatively open contact between extraterrestrial civilizations and early human communities. This era, which corresponds roughly to the period that various ancient traditions describe as a golden age or an age of the gods, is described as a time when the gap between human and galactic civilization was acknowledged rather than concealed, when beings of non-human origin lived and worked openly among human communities, when the transmission of knowledge from advanced to less advanced civilizations was a conscious and systematic process rather than the covert and indirect process it has more recently become. The ancient traditions that preserve memories of this period are extraordinarily diverse, but they share certain common elements. The presence of teachers who were described as divine or semi-divine, but were clearly physical beings with physical needs and limitations. The transmission of specific bodies of knowledge, including astronomy, agriculture, architecture, medicine, and what we would call philosophy. And the gradual withdrawal of these beings from direct human contact as human civilization developed the capacity for greater self-determination. The Andromedan account of why this withdrawal occurred is one of the most politically nuanced aspects of the tradition. It was not, they describe, because the advanced civilizations decided that humans were ready to proceed without assistance. It was the result of a political dispute within the galactic community about the appropriate level and nature of engagement with a developing world. Different civilizations held different views on this question, and the dispute was not resolved quickly or easily. The Andromedans themselves are described as having been proponents of a more cautious, less direct form of engagement, arguing that the open civilizational contact of the earlier period was producing a dependency relationship that would ultimately harm humanity's development of genuine self-determination. Other civilizations, for reasons that mixed sincere concern with more self-interested agendas, preferred to maintain or even intensify the direct engagement. The resolution of this dispute in the Andromedan account established what they describe as a principle of non-interference that has governed much of the subsequent engagement between galactic civilizations and developing worlds. This principle does not prohibit contact. It prohibits the kind of contact that substitutes for a developing civilization's own growth and self-determination. It establishes a threshold of developmental readiness that must be reached before certain types of information and assistance can be shared, and it creates a framework within which engagement can occur without undermining the independence and authentic development of the civilization being engaged. This principle and the debates around it recur throughout the subsequent history of Andromedan engagement with Earth. It explains the indirectness and the ambiguity of much of the contact that has occurred in recent historical periods. It explains why the Andromedans do not simply land their ships on the White House lawn and present humanity with everything they know. It explains why the contact occurs in the way it does, through individual witnesses, through gradual seeding of ideas, through what might be called consciousness raising rather than direct information transfer. They are walking a line, and they are aware of walking it, between helping and overriding, between sharing what they know and imposing what they believe. The period of ancient history that most directly preserves the memory of this earlier era of open contact is the period that conventional historians associate with the first great civilizations of the ancient Near East, the period of Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, Egypt, and the Indus Valley. The Andromedan account describes this period as one in which the withdrawal of open contact was not yet complete, in which the transition from divine human to purely human civilization was still underway, and in which the advanced beings who had been active on Earth during the earlier period were still present but in a more covert and advisory capacity rather than as open participants in human society. This is consistent with what the Sumerian texts describe, a period when the Anunnaki, the beings who feature centrally in the Sumerian mythological tradition, were withdrawing from direct involvement in human society while still maintaining an indirect influence through the priesthood and the royal lineages they had established. The Andromedan account identifies the Anunnaki tradition, the great beings of the Sumerian texts, not as a single unified group, but as a collection of different civilizational elements with different agendas, operating in the same general region and period of Earth's history. Some of these elements in the Andromedan account represented the more benevolent traditions that had guided Earth's development in earlier periods. Others represented a different, more self-interested agenda, one that will be explored in detail in a later section. The complexity of the ancient record, the way that the Anunnaki are described as both creators and oppressors, both teachers and exploiters, is, in the Andromedan account, a reflection of a real political complexity among the advanced beings active on Earth during this period, not a confusion or contradiction in the mythology. The transition from the ancient period to what we might call the medieval and early modern period of extraterrestrial contact with Earth is described by the Andromedans as one of progressive withdrawal and concealment on the part of most galactic civilizations. The open contact of the earlier era had produced, through various historical circumstances that the Andromedan account describes in some detail, a situation that multiple galactic civilizations agreed was potentially dangerous for Earth's development. The direct presence of beings of clearly superhuman capability in human society had created theological and political dynamics that were interfering with the emergence of genuine human self-determination. The solution, accepted by most, though not all of the civilizations engaged with Earth, was a gradual withdrawal from direct visibility, a transition to forms of engagement that operated through human consciousness rather than alongside it. This withdrawal does not mean that contact ended, it means that contact changed its nature. The period from roughly 3,000 years ago to the 20th century is described, in the Andromedan account, as one of sustained but indirect engagement, in which Andromedan and other galactic civilizations maintained their observation of and occasional intervention in Earth's affairs through means that did not require physical presence visible to the general human population. Contact with specific individuals, particularly those in positions of leadership or creative influence, continued. The guidance of human civilization's intellectual development through the inspiration of philosophy, science, art, and religious insight continued. But the overt physical presence that had characterized the earlier period was largely withdrawn. The 20th century represents, in the Andromedan account, a pivot point. The development of nuclear weapons technology by human civilization created a situation that the galactic community could not observe with indifference. The potential for human civilization to destroy not only itself, but to create effects that would impact the broader region of the galaxy through the temporal and energetic distortions that large-scale nuclear exchange would produce, triggered a renewed and intensified engagement from multiple galactic civilizations. The UFO wave that began in the late 1940s and has continued in various forms to the present day is, in the Andromedan account, a direct response to this nuclear threshold crossing. It represents not invasion, not accident, but a deliberately orchestrated effort by multiple galactic civilizations to begin the process of preparing humanity for a level of engagement that had not been attempted in thousands of years. The specific Andromedan involvement in this modern engagement phase is, according to the contact literature, primarily oriented toward what they describe as consciousness preparation, the gradual expansion of human awareness about the nature of reality, the true history of the species, the situation that currently faces humanity, and the choices that need to be made at both the individual and collective level if humanity is to navigate the challenges of this period successfully. This is why their primary mode of contact in the modern era has been through witnesses like Collier rather than through direct public appearance. They are not avoiding contact, they are calibrating its depth and intensity to what they believe the human consciousness infrastructure can currently absorb without producing the kind of overwhelming destabilization that they regard as counterproductive. The timeline of contact, from the ancient seedings to the modern witness accounts, tells a consistent story when viewed as a whole. It is the story of a civilization maintaining a long, patient, and fundamentally caring engagement with a younger species as that species moves through the turbulent and dangerous process of growing into self-awareness, technological capability, and the potential for participation in the broader community of conscious civilizations. The Andromedans are not bystanders in this process. They are participants with a history of engagement with Earth and humanity that is, by their own account, as long as human civilization itself and considerably longer. Understanding that history is the foundation for understanding everything they say about the present moment and about what they believe humanity now needs to know and to do. The agenda, what the Andromedans want from humanity. Every serious investigation of alleged extraterrestrial contact must eventually confront the question of agenda. What do they want? What is the purpose of their engagement? Why do they care? These questions are not merely idle curiosity. They are the questions that determine whether any given contact account describes something that serves humanity's interests, something that threatens them, or something more complex and ambiguous than either simple framing captures. The Andromedan tradition is unusually explicit on this point. Unlike many contact narratives that describe benevolent beings without specifying what their benevolence is actually oriented toward, or mysterious beings whose purposes remain opaque, the Andromedan accounts that have accumulated across decades of contact testimony provide a reasonably detailed and internally consistent description of what the Andromedans understand themselves to be doing in relation to Earth and humanity. Not everything they describe is comfortable. Not everything they describe is what humans might initially wish to hear. But the description is coherent, and it has a moral seriousness that sets it apart from the vaguer assertions of benevolence that characterize many other contact traditions. The primary Andromedan agenda, as it emerges from the body of contact testimony, can be summarized in a single phrase: the the protection and facilitation of humanity's genuine self-determination. Everything else, the information they share, the contacts they initiate, the observations they maintain, the interventions they occasionally make, flows from this central commitment. But self-determination, in the Andromedan framework, means something more specific and more demanding than it does in human political philosophy. It does not simply mean freedom from external coercion. It means the development of an authentic internal coherence, an integration of consciousness and knowledge and values at the individual and collective level that would allow humanity to make genuinely free and genuinely wise choices about its own future. By this standard, which the Andromedans apparently apply consistently, humanity in its current state does not have self-determination, not because it is being externally coerced, though the Andromedan account includes a significant claim about external coercion that we will address in detail, but because the internal incoherence of human consciousness, the fragmentation, the fear, the dependency on belief systems that are not grounded in genuine understanding of reality, prevents the kind of free and wise choice-making that genuine self-determination requires. Humanity cannot choose freely what it does not understand. It cannot choose wisely what it is afraid of, and it cannot chart its own course when significant aspects of its situation, including the true history of its own species and the nature of the forces that currently influence its development, are concealed from it. This is why the Andromedan commitment to human self-determination translates primarily into an information agenda, the provision of accurate information about the nature of reality, about humanity's history, about the current situation, and about the choices available. They are not prescriptive about what choices humanity should make. They do not tell humanity which political system to adopt, which values to hold, which direction to move in. What they offer is the information that would allow these choices to be made on the basis of reality, rather than on the basis of the carefully maintained illusions that they describe as currently shaping human consciousness. The phrase carefully maintained illusions is not metaphorical, and it brings us to what is perhaps the most controversial and most challenging element of the Andromedan agenda: their persistent and detailed description of an ongoing interference in human consciousness and human civilization by forces that do not have humanity's interests at heart. The Andromedan account is not a simple good versus evil narrative. They are careful to resist that framing, and the more thoughtful researchers who work with this material are equally careful. But the account does describe something that can only be called an opposition. A set of agendas operating in the human world that are oriented not toward humanity's development and self-determination, but toward its continued limitation and exploitation. The nature of these agendas, the identity of those pursuing them, and the means by which they operate are subjects that the Andromedan tradition addresses in considerable detail, and they form the background against which the full scope of the Andromedan agenda toward humanity must be understood. The beings that the Andromedans identify as operating against humanity's interests are not simply human. That is the first and most important thing to establish. The Andromedan account does not describe humanity's current challenges as purely self-generated, as products of human greed, ignorance, and tribalism operating in isolation. It describes those human tendencies as real, as significant, as genuine obstacles to human development. But it also describes them as having been deliberately amplified and exploited by non-human intelligences, whose interests are served by keeping humanity in a state of confusion, fear, and internal division. The specific beings most prominently identified in this context, in both the Andromedan contact literature and the broader body of related contact testimony, are associated with what the Andromedan tradition calls the Draconians, a term that covers a complex family of civilizational lineages rather than a single unified species. The Andromedan account of the Draconian civilization is as detailed and as historically grounded as their account of their own origins, and understanding it is essential to understanding what the Andromedans believe humanity is currently up against. The Draconian civilizational lineage in the Andromedan account originates within our own Milky Way galaxy and represents one of the oldest intelligent species in the galaxy, predating humanity by hundreds of millions of years. They are described as having developed a highly sophisticated and effective civilizational model, but one built on an entirely different philosophical foundation from the Andromedan model, where the Andromedan understanding of consciousness is fundamentally relational, fundamentally oriented toward interconnection and mutual support. The Draconian model is fundamentally hierarchical, fundamentally oriented toward dominance, control, and what the Andromedans describe as the consumption of life force energy from other beings and other worlds. This description of the Draconian agenda as involving the consumption of life force energy is one of the aspects of the Andromedan account that most strains credulity in a modern materialist framework, because it describes something that modern science does not have the conceptual vocabulary to address. Life force energy in the Andromedan framework is not metaphorical. It is a real, if non-material, aspect of the universe, a form of energy associated with consciousness that can be quantified, that flows between beings and between civilizations, and that can be accumulated or depleted. A civilization that has developed the capability to exploit this energy from other beings has, in the Andromedan account, gained access to a resource of enormous value, one that can sustain and amplify the power of that civilization at the expense of the civilizations being exploited. Whether one accepts this framework literally, metaphorically, or not at all, the behavioral description of the Draconian agenda toward Earth and humanity is concrete enough to engage with at the level of observable human history. The Andromedans describe a long-term Draconian strategy for managing Earth as a resource, one that involves maintaining humanity in a state of sufficient development to produce the life force energy that the Draconian system values, while simultaneously preventing humanity from developing the awareness and the capacity that would allow it to recognize and resist its exploitation. This is, by any measure, a sophisticated and patient strategy. It operates not through brute force, which would be counterproductive for the purposes described, but through the manipulation of human belief systems, social structures, and political arrangements in ways that keep humanity productively engaged in activities that generate the desired resource, while simultaneously preventing the development of the awareness that would make the exploitation visible. The specific mechanisms by which this manipulation is described as operating are numerous and detailed in the Andromedan contact literature. They include the management of human religious belief systems to create dependence and hierarchy rather than genuine spiritual development. They include the direction of human economic systems toward arrangements that concentrate power and resources in ways that serve the controlling agenda. They include the manipulation of human educational systems to produce populations that are technically functional but not philosophically awake. And they include direct interference in human consciousness through mechanisms that the Andromedan account associates with what we might call psychic or energetic technology, tools for influencing the emotional and cognitive states of populations in ways that maintain the confusion and fear that the Draconian strategy requires. The Andromedan response to this situation, which is the core of their agenda toward humanity, is not military. They do not describe themselves as engaged in a war with the Draconian forces over Earth, though there are elements of the contact literature that describe historical conflicts of a physical nature. What they describe as their primary mode of engagement with this problem is educational and energetic, the provision of accurate information, combined with what they call the holding of a frequency, a sustained energetic influence that supports the development of clearer consciousness in human individuals and communities, counteracting to whatever degree possible the dulling and confusing energetic influences they describe as operating in the opposite direction. This educational agenda is not passive. The Andromedans describe specific priorities within it, specific bodies of information that they consider most urgently important to share with humanity at this particular moment in history. The most important of these, by their account, is the information about humanity's true nature and potential. This is not inspirational rhetoric. It is a specific factual claim that humanity's nature, its range of capability, its relationship to consciousness, its potential for development is dramatically greater than what human civilization currently understands or acknowledges. That this understanding has been systematically suppressed, both through the external interference already described and through the internal dynamics of human civilization itself, and that the recovery of this understanding is the single most important thing that can shift humanity's current trajectory. The second priority, closely related to the first, is the accurate understanding of humanity's true history, not the sanitized, abbreviated, and selectively edited history that is taught in schools, but the full arc of human existence on this planet, including the periods of extraterrestrial engagement, the interventions that shaped human genetics and consciousness, the civilizations that rose and fell before the periods that conventional history acknowledges, and the forces that have been operating in human civilization since its earliest periods. This historical knowledge is not merely of academic interest. It is, in the Andromedan account, the foundation for understanding the current situation, because the dynamics that are operative in human civilization today are not new. They are the continuation of patterns that have been in place for a very long time, and they cannot be clearly seen without the historical context that makes their deep structure visible. The third priority in the Andromedan information agenda is what they describe as the expansion of human cosmological understanding, the development of a framework for understanding the nature of consciousness, time, the structure of physical reality, and the relationship between the material universe and the broader reality of consciousness that underlies it. This is the most philosophically demanding aspect of what they offer, because it requires the most significant departure from the assumptions of modern materialism. But it is also, in their account, the most practically important, because without this expanded cosmological framework, the other information they provide cannot be fully integrated. Understanding that humanity has been interfered with by non-human intelligences requires, for that understanding to be productive, rather than merely terrifying, a framework for understanding what non-human intelligences are, what their relationship to humanity is, and how that relationship fits into the larger story of consciousness in the universe. The Andromedan agenda also includes what might be called a watch and warn function. In the testimony that has accumulated across decades, there are numerous specific warnings about trends and events in human civilization that the Andromedans describe as pointing in dangerous directions. Some of these warnings have been strikingly prescient. Collier's 1990s accounts, for instance, described in considerable detail the development of a surveillance and control infrastructure using digital communications technology years before the internet had become the dominant medium of human communication. He described specific technologies for the manipulation of human perception and cognition, technologies whose existence was not publicly known at the time, but which subsequent revelations have made increasingly credible. He described specific geopolitical dynamics and conflicts that have since materialized in recognizable form. This apparent prescience is one of the most difficult aspects of the Andromedan contact tradition for skeptics to address, and it is also one of the most important for researchers trying to assess the validity of the claims. If the contact accounts contained nothing but vague generalities, they could reasonably be dismissed as sophisticated guesswork. The presence of specific falsifiable predictions that have proven accurate over time does not prove that the contact is genuine. There are alternative explanations, but it raises the evidentiary standard for dismissal considerably. The ultimate Andromedan agenda, as it emerges from the full body of contact testimony, is oriented toward what they describe as humanity's graduation into the broader community of conscious civilizations. This is not a term they use lightly, and it does not carry the patronizing connotation it might seem to. It is a description of a real developmental threshold, a transition from a state of planetary civilization, largely unconscious of its place in the cosmos and largely reactive in its development, to a state of cosmically aware civilization, capable of genuine self-determination, capable of engaging with other civilizations as a peer rather than as either a subject or an adversary. This graduation, in the Andromedan account, is not guaranteed. It is possible. It is, given what they describe as humanity's inherent capabilities and the extraordinary circumstances of the current historical moment, genuinely within reach. But it requires active, conscious engagement from within humanity itself. It cannot be delivered from outside. It can only be enabled. That enabling is what the Andromedans describe as their purpose here. And that purpose, maintained across centuries and millennia of patient engagement with a species that has not always made it easy, is the context within which every other aspect of their presence in our world must be understood. The hidden history of Earth, what the Andromedans say really happened. The version of human history taught in schools and presented in textbooks is not false in its particulars. The dates are mostly right. The empires rose and fell roughly as described. The technologies developed in approximately the sequence that archaeology has documented. But this version of history is, according to the Andromedan account, profoundly incomplete in ways that are not accidental. The gaps in what is publicly known and officially acknowledged about the history of this planet are not the natural result of incomplete archaeological evidence. They are, at least in significant part, the result of a systematic management of human historical understanding that has been in place for longer than any currently acknowledged civilization. The claim is extraordinary. The evidence for it, from the Andromedan perspective, is equally extraordinary, and it begins with what they say about the planet itself, about its geological and biological history, and about the civilizations that the Andromedans claim existed on Earth long before the earliest period that mainstream history acknowledges. The Andromedan account places the first genuinely civilized human societies on Earth at a time frame substantially earlier than the conventional historical consensus. While mainstream archaeology places the earliest complex civilizations at roughly 5,000 to 6,000 years ago in ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt, the Andromedan account describes civilizational activity on Earth that it places at periods ranging from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of years in the past. These earlier civilizations are described as having been more sophisticated in some respects and less sophisticated in others than what emerged later. They had, according to the Andromedan account, a more direct and functional understanding of the relationship between consciousness and physical reality than any subsequent civilization has possessed. They had access to technologies that operated on principles that modern science does not currently acknowledge. But they were, in many ways, more vulnerable than later civilizations because they lacked the defensive experience that comes from having survived civilizational crises. The most significant of these earlier civilizations that the Andromedans describe is associated with what many researchers and alternative historians have called the Atlantean tradition, though the Andromedan account makes clear that this label, borrowed from Plato's philosophical dialogue, covers a much more complex reality than a single sunken civilization. What is described is a period of advanced human civilization centered in different locations at different times that extended across a period of perhaps 20 to 30,000 years and ended not in a single catastrophe but in a series of catastrophic events spanning several thousand years, events associated both with natural geological processes and with what the Andromedans describe as the direct consequences of technologies that were deployed beyond the understanding and wisdom of the civilization using them. This description of civilizational collapse through technological overreach is one of the recurring motifs in the Andromedan account, appearing both in their description of their own early history and in their description of Earth's prehistorical period. It is not a coincidence. The Andromedans describe this pattern, the dangerous gap between technological capability and the wisdom needed to use it safely, as one of the most reliably recurring crises in the development of young civilizations, and one of the most important to navigate successfully. That humanity is currently in the midst of a version of this crisis is, in their account, one of the primary reasons their engagement with Earth has intensified in the modern period. The collapse of the earlier advanced civilizations on Earth left, in the Andromedan account, two primary legacies. The first is the physical evidence, the geological anomalies, the underwater structures, the unexplained archaeological sites that do not fit neatly into the conventional timeline of human development. The second is the cultural memory, the worldwide flood traditions, the accounts of a previous golden age followed by catastrophic decline, the mythological memories of beings of superhuman capability who lived among humans in earlier times. Both of these legacies are present in the archaeological and mythological record, accessible to anyone who approaches them without the preconceptions of the conventional timeline. The Andromedan account of what happened after the collapse of these earlier civilizations is one of the most sobering aspects of the tradition. The survivors of the catastrophic period were not simply starting over from a clean slate. They were beginning again in a world that had been significantly altered by the catastrophes, with a reduced population, reduced access to the resources and knowledge of the earlier civilization, and in the presence of forces, both within the surviving human population and among the non-human intelligences active on Earth, that were actively shaping the direction of the new civilizational development. The role of what the Andromedans call the draconian influence in the direction of post-catastrophe human civilization is, in their account, a critical and largely unacknowledged factor in explaining the shape of the history we know. The civilizations that emerged after the collapse of the earlier advanced cultures, the civilizations of ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and China, were not purely independent human creations. They emerged within a context that was shaped in significant ways by non-human influence, some of which was oriented toward genuine support for human recovery, and some of which was oriented toward the kind of management and control that serves the draconian agenda. The specific mechanisms of this influence, as the Andromedans describe them, include both direct physical contact and what might be called systemic influence, the shaping of human institutional structures, belief systems, and cultural patterns in ways that produce the desired outcomes without requiring ongoing direct intervention. The most significant of these systemic influences, according to the Andromedan account, is the design of what we might call the human control architecture, the religious, political, and economic structures that have characterized most human civilizations throughout recorded history. The claim that these structures were deliberately designed to serve a control agenda rather than emerging organically from human social needs is one of the most challenging aspects of the Andromedan account for most people to consider. It conflicts with the assumption that human social institutions, whatever their flaws, are essentially human in origin and human in purpose. The Andromedan perspective does not dismiss the genuine human elements of these institutions. It acknowledges that humans participated fully in their creation and operation. What it claims is that the basic parameters, the fundamental assumptions about hierarchy, about the relationship between knowledge and power, about the proper organization of human spiritual and political life, were established within a framework that was designed by intelligences whose agenda was not primarily the flourishing of the human beings within those structures. The most specific and detailed version of this claim in the Andromedan contact literature concerns the religious structures of the ancient world, particularly those associated with the Sumerian civilization and its successors. The Andromedan account describes the religious systems of the ancient Near East as deliberate constructions, frameworks designed to create specific psychological and emotional states in their adherents, states of dependency, of unworthiness, of submission to authority that are functionally useful for the kind of energy harvesting operation that the draconian agenda involves. This does not mean that there are no genuine spiritual insights embedded in these traditions. The Andromedan account acknowledges that genuine wisdom and genuine glimpses of cosmic truth do appear in all human religious traditions, but these elements, in their account, are surrounded and often obscured by structural elements designed to prevent their full development and application. The parallel between the ancient Sumerian religious structure and the subsequent religious traditions that developed from it, including Judaism, Christianity, and Islam in their institutional forms, is drawn explicitly in the Andromedan account. The concept of a jealous, demanding, all-powerful deity who requires submission and obedience and who punishes deviation from prescribed behavior is, in the Andromedan framework, not a genuine description of the nature of cosmic consciousness or divine reality. It is a political construction, a theological framework designed to produce in human populations the qualities of dependency and submission that serve the management agenda. This is an interpretation that many people, both religious and secular, will find deeply offensive. It is presented here not as the definitive truth, but as what the Andromedan tradition claims, which is what this exploration is intended to convey. The hidden history of Earth that the Andromedans describe also includes specific claims about the manipulation of human genetics, claims that have direct implications for understanding the current nature and potential of the human species. The Andromedan account describes multiple deliberate interventions in human genetic development over the past several 100,000 years, some oriented toward expansion and enhancement of human cognitive and conscious capability, and some oriented toward limitation and constraint of those same capabilities. The most significant of the constraining interventions is described in the Andromedan account as a deliberate genetic modification that reduced the functional connectivity of the human DNA, essentially creating what they describe as a biological limitation on the range of human conscious experience. The claim is that the human species has, encoded in its biological structure, the potential for a range of conscious capability significantly greater than what is currently expressed in the average human life. Access to this fuller range of capability was curtailed by the intervention described, producing a species that functions within a narrower band of potential than its biological inheritance would otherwise support. This claim is not verifiable by current science. It reaches into areas, the relationship between DNA and consciousness, the potential functional range of human cognitive biology, that mainstream science has not yet addressed with sufficient sophistication to confirm or refute. What it produces as a conceptual claim is a framework for understanding certain recurring human experiences that conventional science struggles to address. The occasional emergence of extraordinary cognitive or perceptual capabilities in individual humans, the documented effects of deep meditative practice on the range and quality of conscious experience, the persistent cross-cultural reports of states of awareness that dramatically exceed the ordinary human baseline. These experiences, in the Andromedan framework, are glimpses of the fuller potential that was constrained but not eliminated by the genetic intervention they describe. The knowledge that the Andromedans claim was suppressed in the post-catastrophe reorganization of human civilization is equally specific. They describe a body of understanding, preserved in fragmented form in various esoteric and mystical traditions, that constitutes the practical knowledge of how consciousness actually works, how the relationship between individual awareness and physical reality actually operates, and how human beings can intentionally develop their conscious capability beyond the ordinary baseline. This knowledge, in the Andromedan account, was the central content of the earlier advanced civilizations, and its systematic suppression and distortion by the controlling forces that shaped post-catastrophe civilization is one of the primary reasons for the gap between human potential and human actualization that characterizes our current situation. The pieces of this suppressed knowledge that survive in various traditions, including certain threads in ancient Indian philosophy, in Gnostic Christian mysticism, in Hermeticism, in certain strands of Jewish mysticism, in indigenous shamanic traditions worldwide, are, in the Andromedan account, genuine fragments of a much more complete original understanding. The fragmentary nature of these survivals is not accidental. It is the product of systematic persecution and distortion of this knowledge by the institutional structures that the controlling agenda established. The burning of the Great Library of Alexandria, the persecution of Gnostics and other early Christian heterodox movements, the suppression of indigenous knowledge traditions by colonial powers. These are not simply human atrocities driven by religious zealotry or imperial ambition. In the Andromedan account, they are elements of a long-running strategy to prevent the recovery and dissemination of the full understanding that would free humanity from its current constraints. The hidden history that the Andromedans describe is not a comfortable story. It describes humanity as a species with an extraordinary heritage and an extraordinary potential that has been systematically exploited and constrained by forces far more patient and sophisticated than anything human civilization has yet produced. It describes the world as not what it appears to be, the institutions as not what they claim to be, and the history as not what it is taught to be. For most people, this is a deeply destabilizing set of claims. For the Andromedans, who have apparently shared these claims with considerable deliberateness and care, the destabilization is intentional, not because they want to produce confusion or despair, but because they believe that no genuine transformation of humanity's current situation is possible, as long as that situation is not clearly seen. The old saying that the truth will set you free is, in the Andromedan account, quite literally accurate. Not freedom in the simple political sense, but freedom in the deeper sense of genuine self-determination, genuine capacity for choice grounded in accurate understanding of reality. That freedom begins with seeing what is actually there, including the parts that have been carefully kept in shadow. The Andromedan Council, cosmic governance, and Earth's place within it. The concept of cosmic governance, the idea that the activity of intelligent civilizations across the universe is subject to some form of collective oversight and agreed-upon principles, is one that appears across multiple contact traditions and multiple alleged insider accounts. It is also, naturally, one that raises immediate and profound questions. Who has the authority to govern across interstellar and intergalactic distances? On what basis are such principles established? How are they enforced? What happens when they are violated? And where, in this framework, does humanity currently stand? The Andromedan account addresses these questions with what might be described as the most detailed and internally consistent description of cosmic governance available in the contact literature. Whether that description accurately reflects a real structure of galactic civilization or represents the elaborate intellectual construction of a very sophisticated contact tradition is a question that cannot be definitively answered with currently available evidence. What can be said is that the description is coherent, that it has remained consistent across decades of contact testimony, and that it has conceptual implications that extend well beyond the simple assertion of benevolent space brothers watching over humanity. The governing body that figures most prominently in the Andromedan contact literature is referred to as the Andromedan Council, though this name, which is the English approximation of how contact witnesses have rendered it, somewhat undersells the scope of what is being described. The Andromedan Council in the contact accounts is not a body composed exclusively of beings from the Andromeda Galaxy. It is a governing assembly that draws membership from multiple civilizations across multiple galaxies, and that has as its primary concern the management of what the Andromedan account calls free will zones, regions of the universe where younger civilizations are developing and where the principle of non-interference is intended to protect the integrity of that development. The Andromedan Council is described as having existed for a period of time that, by any human standard, is essentially immeasurable. Its origin, in the contact accounts, is associated with a recognition among the most ancient civilizations in this region of the universe that the presence of multiple advanced civilizations in proximity to developing worlds created a situation that, without coordinated management, would inevitably lead to destructive competition over those worlds. The Council was established as the mechanism for managing this coordination, for establishing the principles that would govern engagement with developing civilizations, and for adjudicating disputes between the advanced civilizations when their interests or activities came into conflict. The principles that govern the Council's activity are described in the contact literature with considerable specificity. The most fundamental is the principle of non-violation of free will, which is understood not merely as the absence of direct coercion, but as a much more demanding standard of respect for the genuine autonomy of developing conscious beings and civilizations. This principle, as the Andromedans apparently interpret and apply it, prohibits not only the direct invasion or conquest of developing worlds, but also the kind of indirect manipulation that prevents the genuine development of self-determination. This is a philosophically sophisticated position, and it has direct implications for the evaluation of what the contact tradition describes as draconian activity on Earth. The second foundational principle is what might be called the principle of transparent engagement. The requirement that any advanced civilization engaging with a developing world do so in ways that, even if not immediately legible to the developing civilization, are ultimately oriented toward transparency rather than concealment. This principle is in tension with the non-interference principle in ways that the Council apparently spends considerable time managing. There are situations in which full transparency with a developing civilization would itself constitute a form of interference, imposing knowledge and context that the developing civilization is not yet equipped to integrate. Finding the line between enabling transparency and imposing it is one of the most persistent challenges of cosmic governance, and the contact literature contains numerous references to debates within and around the Council about how to navigate this tension in relation to Earth specifically. The Council's structure is described as genuinely democratic in the most fundamental sense, though not in the specific institutional form that democracy takes in any human political system. All member civilizations have a voice in Council deliberations. Decisions are made by a process that prioritizes the emergence of genuine consensus rather than the mechanical counting of votes. The time horizon of Council deliberations is vastly longer than anything that human political processes contemplate. Decisions that appear in the contact literature as matters of current concern have been under consideration, in some cases, for thousands of years by human reckoning. The patience implied by this is not the patience of bureaucratic torpor. It is the patience of beings who understand that genuine consensus, in the full sense of the term, cannot be manufactured on a short timeline. The Council's relationship to Earth has been a matter of intense and sustained discussion throughout the period that the Andromedan account covers. Earth occupies an unusual position in the Council's frame of reference, for reasons that are both philosophical and practical. The philosophical reason is the one already touched upon in the discussion of Andromedan agenda: humanity's potential role as a bridge consciousness, as a form of biological awareness capable of unprecedented integration of the physical and the non-physical, makes the trajectory of human development a matter of genuine significance for the broader community of conscious civilizations. A humanity that fulfills this potential becomes a member of the galactic community with extraordinary capabilities and extraordinary contributions to offer. A humanity that fails to fulfill it, whether through self-destruction, through the successful capture of its development by the controlling forces, or through some other failure mode, represents a genuine loss not just for Earth, but for the broader community. The practical reason for Earth's unusual position in Council deliberations is the intensity and complexity of the competing interests that have been focused on Earth throughout its history. More civilizations with more varied agendas have been engaged with Earth than is typical for a developing world of its current stage of development. This has produced a political situation around Earth that is, by Andromedan account, more complex and more contentious than most of the situations the Council routinely manages. The debates about what principles apply, how they should be interpreted, which activities by which civilizations constitute violations, and what responses are appropriate to those violations have been ongoing for a very long time, and they are by no means resolved. The specific question of what the Council describes as the draconian situation on Earth is one of the most politically sensitive in the Council's recent history. The Andromedan account describes an ongoing dispute about the extent to which draconian activity on Earth constitutes a violation of the free will principle that would justify direct Council intervention. On one side of this dispute are those who argue that the evidence of draconian manipulation of human civilization is extensive and clear, and that the Council has an obligation to act to protect humanity's genuine self-determination. On the other side are those who argue that human civilization has, through its own choices and its own failures to pursue the available understanding, implicitly consented to the current situation, and that direct Council intervention would itself constitute a violation of free will by denying humanity the learning experience that its current challenges represent. This debate is not merely academic. Its resolution, or lack of resolution, has direct implications for what the Andromedans and other Council-affiliated civilizations are and are not permitted to do in relation to Earth. The current situation, as the contact literature presents it, is one in which the Council has arrived at a compromise position, a significantly intensified level of indirect engagement with Earth, providing information, support, and what might be called energetic assistance, but stopping short of the kind of direct visible intervention that would resolve the situation without requiring genuine human participation in its resolution. This compromise is, in the Andromedan account, a genuine expression of care for humanity's long-term development rather than a convenient excuse for inaction. They describe the conviction, held across the council membership, that a humanity which resolves its current situation through its own growing awareness and its own collective action will emerge from that resolution in a fundamentally stronger and more capable state than a humanity whose situation is resolved for it by outside intervention. The transformation they seek for humanity is not one that can be received, it must be enacted, and the enacting requires the authentic engagement of human consciousness with the challenges that currently face it. The Andromedan Council's composition includes civilizations that have vastly different histories and different relationships to Earth. The Andromedans themselves are among the most consistent advocates for a balanced approach that supports human development without overriding it. The Pleiadians, another group frequently mentioned in contact literature, are described as having a more emotionally direct relationship with humanity, given what the Andromedan account describes as a closer genetic relationship, and are sometimes described as more inclined toward direct intervention. The Syrians, another civilizational lineage prominent in the contact tradition, bring yet another perspective, rooted in a very long and complex history of engagement with Earth that the Andromedan account describes as having been instrumental in shaping the civilization of ancient Egypt. The diversity of the Council's membership is, in the Andromedan account, one of its greatest strengths and one of its most persistent sources of internal tension. The Council's enforcement mechanisms, to the extent that the contact literature addresses them, are described as operating primarily through collective agreement and collective pressure, rather than through anything resembling a galactic police force. A civilization that violates the established principles faces the withdrawal of the relationships and resources that Council membership provides, as well as the active opposition of Council members to its activities. In extreme cases, the contact literature suggests that direct physical intervention has occurred, including what are described as battles or confrontations of a physical nature between Council-aligned civilizations and those operating outside Council principles. But these extreme responses are described as historically rare and as undertaken only under circumstances where no lesser response would be adequate. The Council's awareness of Earth's current situation is described as comprehensive. They monitor, through means that the contact literature does not describe in technical detail, the state of human civilization, the activity of non-Council aligned intelligences in relation to Earth, and the trajectory of human development as measured by various indicators that their framework provides. Their assessment of where that trajectory currently stands is one of the more urgently communicated elements of the Andromedan contact testimony, and it is the subject of the next section. What the Council apparently describes as the most critical period in Earth's recent history corresponds to the period we are currently living through, a period of compressed and accelerating change in which the choices made by human civilization in the near term will have consequences that extend far into the future in ways that are unusually hard to reverse. This urgency is one of the reasons the modern engagement phase is described as more intensive than what has preceded it, and it is why the information being shared through contact witnesses in the current period is more specific and more direct than what was typically shared in earlier periods. The Council's relationship to Earth is not that of a detached administrative body managing the fate of an inconsequential planet. It is, in the Andromedan account, a relationship of genuine stake and genuine care among civilizations that have been engaged with this world and with the beings on it for longer than any human history records. The outcome of Earth's current period of transformation is, by their account, a matter of genuine concern to the broadest reaches of the galactic community. And the Council's work, patient and long horizon as it is oriented ultimately toward the day when Earth and humanity take their own place at its table. Andromedan technology, the science behind the impossible. Of all the aspects of the Andromedan contact tradition that draw the interest of researchers and curious observers alike, the descriptions of technology are among the most immediately compelling and among the most difficult to assess. Human fascination with advanced technology is deep and understandable. Technology is the domain in which human civilization has made its most dramatic and most measurable advances in recent centuries. And it is natural to imagine that beings of greater cosmic age and wisdom would possess technologies that make ours look primitive. The Andromedan contact accounts do describe technologies of precisely this kind, but they describe them in a way that challenges the fundamental assumptions about what technology is and how it works that underlie the human technological tradition. The most fundamental of those assumptions is that technology is a purely material affair, machines made of matter that manipulate matter in accordance with the laws of physics. Human technology, from the stone hand axe to the modern semiconductor, operates on this principle. The sophistication increases dramatically across that range, but the principle remains the same. Physical matter, shaped by human intelligence and intention, operating on physical matter to produce desired effects. The Andromedan account describes technologies that operate on a fundamentally different principle, one that integrates consciousness with the physical manipulation of matter and energy in ways that make the clean distinction between technology and consciousness essentially meaningless. The propulsion systems that allow Andromedan vessels to traverse the distances between galaxies are described in the contact literature not as engines that generate thrust in any conventional sense, but as systems that interface with the structure of space-time itself, or more precisely, with what the Andromedans describe as the dimensional framework within which physical space-time exists. The concept of dimensions in the Andromedan framework is more expansive than the 4 space-time dimensions of standard physics. It includes additional dimensions of a non-spatial and non-temporal nature, dimensions associated with consciousness itself that provide a kind of infrastructure through which the physical space-time dimensions can be accessed from the outside, so to speak. Navigation through this dimensional infrastructure is described as a process that is fundamentally conscious rather than mechanical. The craft do not have autopilot systems in any meaningful sense. The navigation is performed by beings who have developed, through training and practice, an intimate understanding of the dimensional structure through which they move, and who interface directly with the craft's systems through what might be described as an extended consciousness relationship. The craft, in the most advanced cases, is described as having its own form of awareness, not a human-like consciousness, but a functional intelligence that is oriented toward navigation and that works in partnership with the consciousness of the crew. This description of craft-consciousness partnership is one of several aspects of Andromedan technology that appears, in modified and imperfect form, in the accounts of human whistleblowers from alleged classified programs. There are numerous testimonies from individuals who claim to have worked with what they describe as recovered extraterrestrial vehicles. And a persistent theme in these accounts is the discovery that the vehicles do not respond to conventional mechanical controls. They respond to consciousness, to intention, sometimes specifically to the neural or biometric signatures of individual operators. If these accounts have any validity, they represent a practical and immediate confirmation of the general principle that the Andromedan tradition describes, that the most advanced physical technologies are not separable from the consciousness of those who operate them. The communication technologies described in the Andromedan account are equally challenging to conventional frameworks. They do not describe radio wave-based communications, or even the more exotic electromagnetic communication channels that speculative human physics has considered. They describe communication systems that operate through what they call the consciousness substrate, the non-physical foundation of physical reality, in ways that are not bound by the speed of light or by the attenuation effects that limit all electromagnetic communications across large distances. Communication between civilizations separated by millions of light years of space is described as essentially instantaneous, not because anything is traveling faster than light through conventional space, but because the medium through which the communication occurs is not conventional space at all. The practical implications of such a communication technology are significant. It means that the galactic civilization that the Andromedan account describes is not a loose collection of isolated star systems that manage to maintain contact across the vast delays imposed by light-speed communication. It is a genuinely interconnected community capable of real-time exchange of information and perspective across cosmic distances, organized and responsive in ways that only instantaneous communication makes possible. This real-time connectivity, if genuine, transforms the nature of galactic civilization from the loose and fragile confederation that the distances of space might suggest into something more cohesive and more capable of coordinated action. The medical technologies described in the Andromedan account, to the extent that this term even applies, reflect the same fundamental principles as their other technologies. They do not operate primarily through chemical or mechanical intervention in biological systems. They operate through direct interface with the consciousness substrate of biological life, addressing the underlying energetic and informational templates from which physical biological structure emerges rather than the physical structure itself. This approach to healing is described as both more effective and less disruptive than the chemical-mechanical approach that dominates human medicine because it addresses causation rather than symptom, and because it works with the inherent intelligence of biological life rather than overriding it. The Andromedan account describes specific instruments that are used in their approach to biological support, instruments that operate primarily through focused application of specific frequencies of what they call conscious energy. These frequencies are described as having specific correspondences to the various aspects of biological function, from the genetic level upward, and can be applied with sufficient precision to address disruptions at any level of the biological hierarchy. The concept that every physical condition, including biological dysfunction, has a corresponding pattern in the consciousness substrate, and that addressing the pattern produces resolution of the physical condition, is the theoretical foundation of this approach, and it is a concept that has numerous parallels in human traditions, from traditional Chinese medicine to Ayurveda to various schools of energy healing. What makes the Andromedan application different from these human traditions is the degree of precision and intentionality that comes from a civilization that has understood this principle for millions of years rather than thousands, and that has developed tools specifically calibrated to work with the consciousness substrate in ways that human traditions, working without this understanding and without these tools, can only approximate. The results in the Andromedan account are correspondingly more reliable and more rapid than anything that human healing traditions have yet achieved. The weapons technologies that the Andromedan account describes are, deliberately and explicitly, the aspect of their technological capability that is given the least attention in the contact literature. This is not because such technologies do not exist. The Andromedan account is not naive about the history of conflict in the galactic community, and it acknowledges that Andromedan civilization has, at various points in its history, been required to defend itself and to engage in what might be called active interventions against forces acting in violation of the principles the Council maintains. But the Andromedans apparently regard the detailed description of weapons technology as counterproductive in the context of their engagement with humanity. Humanity already has a well-developed relationship with weapons and conflict. What it needs in the Andromedan account is not more information about how to destroy things, but more information about how to understand and develop things. What the contact literature does describe, in general terms, is that Andromedan defensive and offensive capabilities operate on the same principles as their other technologies, through direct interface with the consciousness substrate, through manipulation of the dimensional framework within which physical reality exists, and through applications of what might be called energetic precision that make purely physical weapons look crude. The most significant Andromedan defensive capability, according to some accounts, is not a weapon at all in the conventional sense, but a capacity for what they describe as consciousness shielding, the ability to create a zone of coherent conscious intention that repels or neutralizes influences oriented toward disruption. This capability operates at multiple scales, from the individual level to the civilizational level, and it is described as both more effective and more ethically sustainable than any purely physical defensive strategy. The energy technologies of the Andromedan civilization are, perhaps, the aspect most immediately relevant to the current human situation, given the central role that energy technology plays in the challenges facing human civilization. The Andromedan account describes an energy technology that has no waste, no scarcity, and no environmental impact because it does not draw on stored physical energy resources at all. It accesses the base creative energy of the universe directly, the zero-point energy that quantum physics has identified as an inherent property of the vacuum of space, but in a form and at a scale that human physics has not yet learned to work with. The energy resources available through this access are, in the Andromedan account, effectively limitless for all practical purposes, and their application produces no byproducts that disrupt the physical or energetic environment. The suppression of research into zero-point energy and related free energy technologies within human civilization is, in the Andromedan account, one of the most specific and most damaging examples of the controlling influence that they describe as operating against humanity's interests. The theoretical foundations for some version of this technology exist within human physics. Researchers working on these foundations have historically faced a pattern of interference, of funding withdrawal, of professional marginalization, and in some cases of more direct pressure that cannot be entirely attributed to the ordinary skepticism of mainstream science. The Andromedan account identifies this pattern of suppression as deliberate, as part of the broader strategy of maintaining human civilization in a state of resource dependency and scarcity that serves the controlling agenda. The constructive technologies described in the Andromedan account, the technologies for creating structures and physical objects, for shaping matter at a fundamental level, are described as operating through what might be called sonic geometry, the use of specific frequencies and patterns of sound to organize matter at the molecular and atomic level into desired configurations. This is a concept that appears in fragmentary and often distorted form in multiple ancient traditions, including the Egyptian, the Hindu, and certain indigenous traditions, as the idea that sound is the fundamental creative force of the universe. The Andromedan account places this ancient intuition on a technical foundation. Sound, in the most general sense of structured vibration in the consciousness substrate, is indeed the primary mechanism by which pattern is imposed on matter, and a civilization that understands this fully can use it as a construction technology of extraordinary precision and capability. The most dramatic application of this principle described in the contact literature is what Collier's contacts apparently described as the ability to construct or modify physical structures at a scale that would, from the human perspective, appear miraculous. The construction of the structures associated with ancient megalithic cultures around the world, the Egyptian pyramids, the Andean stonework, the mysterious megalithic sites of Europe and elsewhere, is described by some researchers as potentially reflecting exactly this kind of technology. The precision and the scale of these constructions, achieved without any technology that conventional archaeology has been able to identify, becomes comprehensible within the framework of sound-based constructive technology, as described in the Andromedan account. The overarching characteristic of all the technologies described in the Andromedan tradition is their integration with consciousness. The machine and the mind are not separate in any of the applications described. This integration is not a limitation or a quirk of Andromedan engineering preference. It reflects the fundamental reality that the Andromedan account describes, a universe in which consciousness is not an epiphenomenon of matter, but the fundamental substrate from which matter emerges. Technology that ignores consciousness is technology that is working against the grain of reality. Technology that integrates consciousness is technology that works with reality at its deepest level and is therefore correspondingly more powerful, more efficient, and more sustainable than any purely material approach can be. This is the principle that underlies the Andromedan account of their technological tradition, and it is the principle that, in their account, humanity will need to embrace if its own technological development is to be redirected from its current trajectory, which they describe as unsustainable and dangerous, toward one that serves the genuine flourishing of both humanity and the larger world of which it is a part. The current crisis, what the Andromedans say about now. The The Andromedan contact tradition is not primarily a retrospective project. The historical and cosmological information that the Andromedans have apparently shared through their contact witnesses is provided as context for understanding a present situation that they describe as genuinely urgent, a moment in the history of Earth and humanity that carries consequences extending far beyond the immediate circumstances that any individual human being can perceive from within those circumstances. The present moment, from the Andromedan perspective, is not a continuation of business as usual. It is, in their account, a period of compression and convergence, a time when multiple long-running trends and processes are arriving simultaneously at critical thresholds, creating a configuration of pressures and opportunities that is genuinely unprecedented in the history of human civilization on this planet. This is not a claim that history is about to end or that some apocalyptic event is imminent. It is a claim about the nature of the choices currently available and the quality of consciousness currently required to navigate those choices toward outcomes that serve humanity's genuine interests. The Andromedan assessment of humanity's current situation begins with an acknowledgement that is, in some ways, the most important single thing they apparently communicate: that humanity has survived its own technological adolescence. This is not a given. The Andromedan tradition describes multiple civilizations in the history of this galaxy and others that did not survive this phase, that reached the capability for large-scale technological destruction before reaching the wisdom to constrain and redirect it, and that destroyed themselves or their worlds before they could make the transition to the next level of development. The survival of humanity to its current stage, in the Andromedan account, is not something to be taken for granted. It reflects, in part, successful interventions by council-affiliated civilizations at critical moments, and in part something that they describe as a quality inherent in human consciousness itself, a resilience and a creative adaptability that has surprised even their long experience with developing civilizations. But survival to this point does not guarantee survival through the current period. The Andromedan account identifies specific present-day trends and conditions that they describe as representing the most significant risk factors for humanity's continued development. These are not presented as inevitable or as determined. They are presented as identifiable challenges that require conscious response if they are to be navigated successfully. The first and most significant of these risk factors is the concentration of what the Andromedans call information control in an increasingly small number of hands. The information revolution that has transformed human civilization since the advent of digital communication technology has a dual character that the Andromedan account describes with considerable precision. On one side, it has dramatically expanded humanity's access to information about itself and its world, enabling forms of collective awareness and collective action that were previously impossible. On the other side, the same infrastructure that enables this expanded access provides an equally powerful tool for the management and manipulation of human perception and consciousness at a scale and with a precision that has never before been available. The Andromedan warning about this dual character of the information revolution is one of the specific predictive elements of the contact literature that has become increasingly recognizable with time. The development of algorithmic content management, the emergence of social media platforms as primary information environments for large portions of the human population, the increasing sophistication of artificial intelligence tools for generating and curating information content, all of these developments have materialized in ways that confirm the general pattern the Andromedan contact literature identified years and in some cases decades before they became obvious. The specific concern the Andromedans express about the development of artificial intelligence is nuanced and not what most people might expect from an alien civilization that presumably has vastly more advanced AI than anything humans have yet produced. They do not describe artificial intelligence as inherently dangerous or as an inevitable threat to humanity. What they describe is the danger of artificial intelligence developed and deployed in the context of the current human civilizational framework, in which the systems being developed carry within them the values, assumptions, and biases of the civilization that created them, including the controlling elements of that civilization whose agendas are oriented toward the maintenance of human limitation rather than the expansion of human potential. An artificial intelligence that optimizes for what the current human information environment defines as valued in the Andromedan concern risks becoming an extraordinarily powerful amplifier of the distortions and manipulations that currently shape that environment, extending the reach and the sophistication of those distortions in ways that make them far harder to recognize and resist. This is not a concern about artificial intelligence becoming conscious and turning against humanity in the science fiction sense. It is a concern about artificial intelligence becoming an exceptionally effective tool for the continuation and intensification of the management agenda that the Andromedans describe as already operating in human civilization. The second major risk factor identified in the Andromedan assessment of the current situation is what they describe as the weaponization of human division. The tendencies toward tribalism, fear of the other, and in-group versus out-group conflict that are inherent in the human psychological inheritance are, in the Andromedan account, being deliberately amplified and exploited by the controlling forces as a strategy for preventing the emergence of the collective human awareness that would be necessary for humanity to recognize and respond to its actual situation. A humanity that is deeply, bitterly divided along the lines of race, nationality, religion, class, and ideology cannot develop the collective consciousness necessary for genuine self-determination. The energy that could go toward creative and constructive engagement with the genuine challenges facing the species is consumed instead by the maintenance of conflicts whose fundamental premise is the incompatibility of different human groups. The Andromedan perspective on human division is, notably, not that diversity itself is a problem. Diversity of perspective, of cultural expression, of individual consciousness is described as one of humanity's greatest strengths, one of the qualities that makes human consciousness particularly interesting and potentially valuable in the broader galactic context. What is described as dangerous is the weaponization of that diversity, the systematic cultivation of the fear and suspicion that transforms genuine difference from an opportunity for mutual enrichment into a basis for mutual destruction. The third risk factor is the one that the Andromedan account treats with perhaps the greatest seriousness: the accelerating degradation of Earth's biological and energetic environment. The ecological crisis that human industrial civilization has created is not, in the Andromedan framework, primarily a story about chemistry and atmospheric physics, though those elements are real and important. It is a story about the disruption of the consciousness substrate that is associated with a living biosphere of sufficient complexity and diversity. Earth's biodiversity is not merely of ecological importance in the narrow biological sense. It is, in the Andromedan account, the physical expression of an extraordinary energetic richness that has developed over hundreds of millions of years and that contributes directly to the quality of conscious experience available on this planet. The destruction of biodiversity is therefore, from the Andromedan perspective, not simply an environmental problem with practical consequences for human civilization's physical sustainability. It is a direct assault on the energetic foundation of human conscious experience, a reduction in the range and quality of consciousness available to beings living on this planet, and ultimately a threat to the specific quality of human consciousness that makes humanity's potential role in the galactic community possible. This connection between biodiversity and the quality of conscious experience is one of the aspects of the Andromedan account that has the least direct parallel in any human scientific framework currently mainstream, and it is one of the elements most likely to be dismissed as New Age mysticism by critics. But within the Andromedan cosmological framework, it follows directly from the principle that physical forms are expressions of consciousness rather than producers of it, and that the richness and diversity of physical life on a planet contributes directly to the richness and diversity of the consciousness substrate of that world. The Andromedan assessment of humanity's current technological trajectory is concerned specifically with the development of what they describe as control technologies. The combination of advanced artificial intelligence, biometric monitoring, genetic modification, and digital communication infrastructure that is, in their account, converging toward the creation of a comprehensive surveillance and management system for human consciousness and behavior. They do not describe this as a planned conspiracy in the simple sense of a group of humans who gathered in a room and decided to create a totalitarian system. They describe it as a convergence driven by multiple forces, some human and some non-human, toward an outcome that serves the controlling agenda through the exploitation of genuine human tendencies toward both the desire for security and the willingness to accept incremental erosions of freedom in exchange for convenience and protection. The specificity of this warning and the degree to which it has materialized in recognizable form is one of the aspects of the Andromedan contact tradition that the most serious researchers find most difficult to dismiss. The convergence of ubiquitous digital monitoring, social credit systems, algorithmic behavior management, and the accelerating development of neurological interface technologies is creating, in the present period, exactly the kind of comprehensive human management infrastructure that the Andromedan contact literature warned about decades ago. But the Andromedan assessment of the current situation is not solely or even primarily focused on threats. It is equally focused on what they describe as unprecedented opportunities. The same convergence of forces that creates the risks described also creates possibilities for positive transformation that are genuinely new. The information revolution, for all its dangers, has also enabled a degree of global human interconnection and mutual awareness that has never before existed. The crisis of ecological and social sustainability that human civilization currently faces is creating, within significant portions of the human population, a depth of motivational urgency and a readiness for fundamental change that the Andromedans describe as historically unusual. Most significantly, the Andromedans describe the current period as one in which something they call the natural cycle of galactic energy is moving through Earth's region of space, producing an energetic environment that is uniquely supportive of the expansion of human consciousness beyond its current baseline. This cycle, which they describe in terms that have resonances with both ancient astrological traditions and with modern speculations about galactic energy cycles, is described as providing a window of opportunity for precisely the kind of accelerated conscious development that humanity needs to navigate its current challenges. The window is described as real and as finite. The opportunity it provides cannot be deferred indefinitely, but within the period it makes available, the potential for transformation in human consciousness is, in the Andromedan account, greater than at any previous point in the history of this civilization. This combination of unprecedented challenge and unprecedented opportunity is what the Andromedans describe as defining the essential character of the current moment in human history. It is not a time for passivity or for waiting to see what happens. It is, in their account, a time for exactly the kind of conscious, informed, and courageous engagement with reality that their entire agenda toward humanity has been oriented toward enabling. The information they have shared through their contact witnesses, the historical, cosmological, and practical understanding they have provided is oriented toward equipping human beings who are ready to engage with that challenge to do so with the greatest possible clarity and effectiveness. The question of what that engagement actually looks like in practical terms at the level of individual human lives and collective human action is the subject of the final section of this exploration. It is also, by the Andromedan account, the question that humanity most needs to be asking itself right now. The future, humanity's destiny, and the Andromedan prophecy. Everything the Andromedans have apparently communicated about the history of Earth, about the nature of their civilization, about the situation currently facing humanity, about the agendas operating in the world, about the technologies available, and the principles of cosmic governance, all of it converges on a single point of ultimate relevance: the future. Not the near-term future of political cycles and economic fluctuations, not the medium-term future of generational change and technological development, but the deep future of humanity as a species and as a form of conscious life in the universe. The Andromedan perspective on this future is not a prophecy in the deterministic sense that the word often implies. They do not describe a fixed outcome that will occur regardless of what humanity does. What they describe is a field of possibilities, a range of potential futures available to humanity depending on the choices, individually and collectively, that human beings make in the period through which we are currently passing. This is not a comfortable framing for those who would prefer either certainty of salvation or certainty of doom. but it is the framing that the Andromedan account consistently maintains, and it is the framing that is most consistent with their foundational commitment to the genuine autonomy of human consciousness. The most positive future that the Andromedan account describes is one that they apparently discuss with genuine warmth and genuine investment. It is a future in which humanity completes the transition to what they describe as fourth density consciousness, a qualitative shift in the nature of human awareness that represents the fulfillment of the potential that the earliest interventions in human development were oriented toward. This shift is not described as a technological event or a political event. It is described as a transformation in the fundamental quality of conscious experience available to human beings, an expansion of awareness that includes direct perception of the consciousness substrate, direct experience of the interconnection of all life, and a capacity for coordinated action grounded in that direct perception that makes the current divisions and conflicts of human civilization essentially obsolete. This transformation is not described as something that will happen to humanity from outside. It is described as something that humanity must do, must choose, must work toward through the genuine development of individual and collective consciousness. The Andromedan engagement, the information they provide, the energetic support they offer, the warnings they deliver, is all oriented toward making this choice visible and making the working toward it as effective as possible. But the choice and the work must be human. The Andromedan description of what a fourth density humanity would look like is one of the most detailed and evocative aspects of the contact literature. It describes a humanity that has recovered its full biological and cognitive potential, operating with the expanded range of conscious experience that was constrained by the genetic modifications described earlier. It describes a humanity that has developed the direct energetic perception that is currently available only to exceptional individuals in exceptional circumstances. It describes a humanity that has resolved the fundamental confusion about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to physical reality that currently drives so much of human suffering, individual and collective. Practically, it describes a civilization that has developed technology consistent with these expanded capabilities, technology that integrates consciousness rather than ignoring it, that draws on the limitless energy of the consciousness substrate rather than burning through finite physical resources, that builds and heals and communicates through principles that the current human technological tradition only dimly perceives. It describes a civilization that has resolved the political and economic structures of dominance and exploitation that have characterized so much of recorded human history, not through utopian idealism, but through the practical expression of a level of consciousness that simply does not generate those structures because it is operating from an understanding of reality that makes their premises obviously false. It describes a humanity that has become, in the fullest sense of the term that the Andromedan tradition uses, a member of the galactic community, capable of engaging with civilizations like the Andromedans not as students or as subjects or as objects of management, but as peers, as contributors, as co-participants in the ongoing exploration of the universe that all conscious beings share. The Andromedan account of what happens when humanity achieves this membership is one of the few areas of the contact literature that touches on what might be called genuine mystery, areas where even the Andromedans apparently acknowledge the limits of their own understanding. They describe a universe that is richer, stranger, and more layered than even their own considerable experience has fully explored. They describe dimensions of existence beyond the ones they currently inhabit, processes of consciousness development that extend beyond the stages they have themselves achieved, aspects of the nature of reality that remain genuinely unknown even to civilizations of their extraordinary age. In describing these limits, the Andromedans communicate something that may be the most important single message of their entire tradition, that the journey does not end, that there is no point at which consciousness, individually or collectively, arrives at a final resting place of complete understanding and perfect development. The universe is not a puzzle to be solved, but a reality to be engaged with inexhaustibly across whatever extent of time and form that engagement takes. The graduation to galactic membership that they describe as humanity's potential future is not an ending, it is a beginning, the beginning of a phase of engagement with the cosmos that is vaster and more extraordinary than anything that the current human framework can adequately imagine. The Andromedan warning about the alternative futures is equally clear, if considerably less pleasant to contemplate. A humanity that fails to make the necessary conscious development, that allows the controlling forces to complete the management architecture currently being assembled, that remains too divided, too distracted, too embedded in the current framework of confusion and fear to recognize and respond to its actual situation, is described as a humanity that faces a period of very considerable difficulty. The Andromedan account does not describe extinction as the likely outcome of failure. They describe a prolonged period of constraint, of continued exploitation and limitation, of delayed potential that could extend for a very long time before circumstances again align to provide the kind of opportunity that the current moment offers. This framing of the alternative as delay rather than destruction reflects, in a sense, the Andromedan fundamental optimism about consciousness itself. Consciousness, in their framework, cannot be ultimately destroyed. It can be constrained, distorted, delayed, and made to suffer, but it cannot be eliminated because it is the fundamental substance of reality. A humanity that chooses, through inaction or through insufficient awareness, to miss the current opportunity does not cease to exist. It continues, in a diminished and constrained form, through whatever additional period of development is required before genuine self-determination becomes available again. But the Andromedans apparently communicate the conviction that this delay is not necessary, that the current opportunity is real and significant and within reach. They describe a critical mass of human consciousness that, once achieved, creates a kind of self-reinforcing dynamic of awakening that no external interference can effectively counter. They describe the work of individual human beings who genuinely commit to the development of their own conscious awareness, to the honest engagement with the reality of their situation, to the cultivation of genuine understanding rather than comfortable belief, as contributing directly to the approach of this critical mass in ways that are not merely symbolic but energetically real. Each individual who genuinely wakes up, in the Andromedan account, is not just one person changing their mind. They are a node in a network of consciousness that is gradually becoming coherent enough to function as a collective force for the kind of transformation that the current moment requires. This is not spiritual rhetoric. It is, in the Andromedan framework, a description of how consciousness actually works at the collective level, not as a simple aggregate of individual awarenesses, but as a genuinely emergent collective phenomenon whose properties are qualitatively different from and greater than the sum of its individual components. The Andromedan tradition ends in the most comprehensive versions of the contact literature, not with a prescription or a prediction, but with an invitation. An invitation to humanity, individually and collectively, to take seriously the full reality of what it is and what it faces and what it is capable of. An invitation to engage with the actual history of this species and this planet, rather than the sanitized version that has been made available. An invitation to develop the genuine understanding of consciousness and reality that the suppressed traditions of human wisdom have always been pointing toward. An invitation to choose, with full awareness of what the choice entails, the path toward genuine self-determination and genuine participation in the larger reality of the universe. The Andromedans, as they apparently communicate through their contact witnesses, have maintained their engagement with Earth and humanity across a span of time that dwarfs the entire recorded history of human civilization. They have witnessed the emergence of human consciousness, its early flourishing, its catastrophic setbacks, its long and halting and painful climb toward the current moment. They have seen what humanity is and what it can be. They have, by their own account, a genuine investment in the outcome of the current period that goes beyond the intellectual interest of scientists observing a developing phenomenon. It is perhaps the most extraordinary claim in the entire Andromedan tradition that beings of such antiquity and such capability, beings whose civilization extends across millions of years of accumulated wisdom and experience, genuinely care about the fate of a young species on a small planet in the outer arm of a minor galaxy, that they care not as parents care for children, not as managers care for resources, not as scientists care for specimens, but as beings who recognize in humanity something they recognize in themselves, the capacity of consciousness to choose, to grow, to transform, and to contribute something genuinely new and irreplaceable to the endless unfolding of the universe. That recognition is the deepest foundation of their engagement, and understanding it, believing it or not believing it, holding it as a question rather than an answer, may be the most important thing that any individual human being who encounters this tradition can take away from it. Not the specific claims about galactic politics or ancient history or advanced technology. Not the warnings about controlling forces or the promises of transformation, but the fundamental proposition that lies beneath all of it, that what happens here matters, that who we are and who we choose to become is not irrelevant to the larger story of consciousness in the universe. That is what the Andromedans, across all the complexity and controversy and challenge of everything they apparently say, seem most fundamentally to want humanity to know, and perhaps that, more than anything else, is worth sitting with. The genetic manipulation of humanity. There is no subject within the Andromedan contact tradition that carries more immediate and more personal weight than what the Andromedans apparently say about the human body itself. Every other dimension of their testimony, the cosmic history, the political structures, the civilizational agendas, the nature of the controlling forces, all of it can be held at some philosophical distance by the individual encountering it for the first time. It can be processed as interesting, as disturbing, as paradigm challenging, while still feeling in some sense external to the deepest questions of personal identity. But when the Andromedan account turns to the human genome, when it claims that the biological architecture of the human species has been deliberately modified, that the body you inhabit and the range of consciousness you experience within it have been shaped by interventions you never consented to and until recently never knew about, the distance collapses. The claim becomes intimate in the most literal possible sense. It becomes a claim about what you are. The Andromedan account of human genetic history begins with a statement that is both extraordinary and, within the framework the tradition establishes, entirely logical. The human genome, as it exists in its current form, is not the product of natural evolution alone. It is the product of a process that combines natural evolutionary development with multiple deliberate interventions across a span of time that stretches back hundreds of thousands of years. Those interventions have come from different sources, have been oriented toward different purposes, and have produced a genome of extraordinary complexity, extraordinary potential, and extraordinary suppression. A biological structure that carries within it capabilities far beyond what any human being in the current era routinely expresses. The natural evolutionary baseline that preceded these interventions is described in the Andromedan account as having been a primate line of considerable cognitive promise. The lineage that would eventually become Homo sapiens had, through its own evolutionary development, arrived at a brain and nervous system architecture that represented a genuinely unusual biological configuration, a system capable of a degree of self-reflection, a degree of abstraction, and a degree of social intelligence that was not common in the evolutionary history of any planet. This natural promise is what made the lineage interesting, from the perspective of civilizations looking at Earth as a site of potential for the kind of consciousness development they understood as significant. The first deliberate intervention described in the Andromedan account is one associated with what the tradition calls the original seeding, an introduction of consciousness of a specific quality into the most developed primate form available. This intervention is described not as a genetic modification in the simple laboratory sense, but as something more fundamental, a deliberate alignment of the biological system with a higher dimensional pattern of consciousness, one that the natural evolutionary process alone could not have produced on the time frame that the civilizations involved were working with. The result was the emergence of genuine self-aware consciousness in a biological form that had been developing the hardware for it through natural processes, but had not yet completed the connection between that hardware and the broader consciousness substrate that the intervention established. This description maps, in its general character, onto the mystery that has long puzzled evolutionary biologists about the emergence of Homo sapiens. The apparent discontinuity in the archaeological record at approximately 200,000 years ago, when modern human anatomy and apparently modern human cognitive capability appears without the gradual developmental trajectory that the evolutionary framework would predict. The Andromedan account does not propose that natural evolution is false. It proposes that the specific emergence of self-aware consciousness in the human lineage involved an intervention that supplemented and accelerated a natural evolutionary process that was already pointing in that direction, but that would have taken considerably longer to arrive at the same result without assistance. Following this initial seeding, the Andromedan account describes a long period during which humanity's development proceeded within a complex field of competing interventions from different civilizational sources. This period, which corresponds roughly to the extended span of prehistorical human existence that conventional archaeology documents through stone tool assemblages, cave art, burial practices, and other traces of behavioral modernity, was not a period of simple, unguided development. It was a period during which multiple advanced civilizations, with different interests and different agendas, were engaged with the developing human consciousness in ways that had direct effects on both the genetic and the cultural dimensions of that development. The genetic effects of this engagement, as the Andromedans described them, were significant. Multiple civilizations, at various points in this extended prehistorical period, introduced genetic modifications into the human lineage that were oriented toward different purposes. Some of these modifications were genuinely enhancing, adding capabilities to the human biological system that it did not possess from its natural evolutionary baseline alone. These enhancing modifications included what the Andromedan account describes as expansions of the range of sensory perception available to the human nervous system, including the development of a capacity for direct energetic perception that exists in most humans in a substantially suppressed state. They included enhancements to the human brain's capacity for multi-dimensional processing, the ability to hold and integrate multiple frameworks of understanding simultaneously rather than being limited to the sequential, linear processing that characterizes most ordinary human cognitive experience. And they included what the Andromedan account describes as modifications to the human capacity for direct communication with the consciousness substrate, enhancements that form the biological foundation for what humanity's mystical traditions have preserved as the possibility of genuine enlightenment, a direct, unmediated experience of the nature of reality beyond the filtering of ordinary sensory perception. These enhancing modifications are described as the contributions of civilizations aligned with the Andromedan tradition and with the broader council perspective, civilizations whose engagement with humanity was oriented toward the fulfillment of the potential described earlier, humanity as a bridge consciousness, capable of unique contributions to the galactic community's understanding of consciousness in physical form. These contributions to the human genome represent, in the Andromedan account, some of the most valuable and most deliberately suppressed aspects of human biological inheritance, because their activation would produce exactly the kind of expanded human capability that the controlling agenda most fears and most seeks to prevent. The suppressing modifications are the other side of this genetic history, and they are described with equal specificity and considerably greater moral weight. The Andromedans describe a series of deliberate interventions in the human genome that were oriented not toward the enhancement of human capability, but toward its systematic limitation, toward the creation of a biological system that would operate within a narrower band of potential than its full inheritance would otherwise support. These suppressing modifications are attributed, in the Andromedan account, primarily to the draconian civilizational lineage and its allies, and they are described as having been introduced at specific historical moments when the opportunity arose to do so, without triggering the kind of response from council-aligned civilizations that would have prevented them. The most significant of these suppressing modifications is described in terms that require some explanation of the Andromedan understanding of DNA before they can be properly appreciated. In the Andromedan framework, DNA is not merely a chemical storage medium for the instructions required to build a protein. It is something considerably more complex and considerably more important. A biological interface between the physical body and the consciousness substrate, a transducer that converts patterns of conscious intention and awareness into physical biological expression, and that converts physical sensory experience into patterns of information in the consciousness substrate. The full function of DNA, in this understanding, encompasses not just the protein coding sequences that molecular biology has cataloged, but the vast majority of the genome that molecular biology has historically dismissed as junk DNA, sequences with no apparent protein coding function. The Andromedan account is explicit on this point. The sequences that molecular biology has called junk are not junk. They are the consciousness interface portion of the genome, the part of the biological system that manages the relationship between the physical body and the non-physical dimensions of consciousness. Their apparent silence in the genetic code, the absence of protein coding function that led to their dismissal as evolutionary debris, is not because they have no function. It is because their function is not the production of proteins. Their function operates at a different level of biological reality, one that current molecular biology does not yet have the tools to observe. The suppressing modification that the Andromedans describe as most significant was, in their account, an alteration to the functional activity of precisely these consciousness interface sequences, a modification that reduced their operational activity from the much higher level at which they originally functioned to the substantially lower level at which they currently function in the vast majority of humanity. The effect of this modification in the Andromedan account was a dramatic reduction in the bandwidth of the human consciousness interface, a narrowing of the range of conscious experience available within the biological human system, and a corresponding reduction in the practical capabilities that full bandwidth operation of the human consciousness system would support. The results of this reduction are, in the Andromedan account, precisely what we observe as the ordinary human condition, a species with a biological system of extraordinary potential that is, in its normal operation, accessing only a fraction of that potential. A species that occasionally, through specific practices, extreme experiences, or spontaneous grace, gets glimpses of a much wider range of conscious experience than ordinary life provides, but cannot sustain those glimpses or integrate them into ordinary functioning. A species whose intuition about its own limitations is paradoxically accurate, that it is somehow less than what it could be, that the consciousness it normally experiences is somehow narrower and dimmer than what its nature would support at full expression. The suppression of this consciousness interface function is not merely a philosophical harm. In the Andromedan account, it has immediate practical consequences for human life and human civilization. The emotional turbulence, the mental suffering, the pervasive sense of isolation and meaninglessness that characterize so much of human psychological experience are not simply the unavoidable products of conscious life in a physical world. They are, in significant part, the products of operating a consciousness system at reduced bandwidth in a reality that is much more interconnected, much more meaningful, and much more supportive of conscious life than the reduced bandwidth experience of it suggests. A human being operating at full consciousness bandwidth in the Andromedan account would experience reality as a fundamentally different place than the one that ordinary human experience presents. Not a fantasized utopia, but a world whose true character, its depth, its interconnection, its responsiveness to conscious intention is legible in a way that the suppressed state does not permit. This claim has direct implications for how the Andromedans understand both the current human situation and the nature of the transformation they describe as both possible and necessary. The transformation they call the shift to fourth density consciousness is not, in their account, a purely metaphysical event that will simply happen to humanity from outside. It is, at least in part, a biological event, the reactivation of the suppressed consciousness interface function in the human genome, the restoration of a higher level of operational activity in the sequences that molecular biology has mistakenly dismissed as junk. This reactivation is not being waited for passively. It is, according to the Andromedan account, actively underway, driven by a combination of the natural galactic energy cycle already described, the intention and practice of individual human beings who are working to develop their conscious capabilities, and the energetic support that council-aligned civilizations are providing within the constraints of the non-interference principle. The rate and completeness of this reactivation is not predetermined. It depends, in significant part, on the choices made by human beings individually and collectively. A human consciousness that is fully engaged in the distraction, fear, and internal division that the controlling forces cultivate is a consciousness that provides little fertile ground for the reactivation process. A human consciousness that is actively engaged in the development of genuine awareness, in the honest examination of reality, including the aspects that are uncomfortable to see, in the cultivation of the internal coherence and stillness that allows the consciousness interface to begin functioning at higher levels, is a consciousness in which the reactivation process can make measurable progress within a single lifetime. The Andromedan account also addresses the question of why, if the genetic suppression is real and is the product of intervention rather than nature, it has not simply been reversed by the council-aligned civilizations that have the capability to do so. The answer, consistent with everything else in the Andromedan account about the principle of non-interference, is that a genetic restoration imposed from outside, without the participation and the consent of the human beings whose genetics are being restored, would itself constitute a violation of free will, even in its apparently benevolent form. The restoration of the human genetic potential must, in the Andromedan account, be something that humanity participates in actively, that it chooses, that it works toward, rather than something that is simply done to it regardless of its own participation. This is not a convenient excuse for inaction. It is a principled position that reflects the Andromedan understanding of what genuine development requires, that the being developing is genuinely active in the process, not merely the recipient of changes imposed by another's will, however well-intentioned. The practical implication of this position is that the most powerful thing any individual human being can do in relation to the genetic suppression in the Andromedan account is precisely what seems most purely personal and most apparently disconnected from any larger project: to develop their own conscious awareness as fully and as honestly as possible. The cultivation of genuine stillness, of genuine honesty with oneself about the nature of one's experience, of genuine inquiry into the nature of consciousness and reality. These are not merely self-improvement projects. They are, in the Andromedan understanding, direct contributions to the collective process of genetic restoration, because they create in the individual human consciousness the conditions under which the suppressed sequences begin to reactivate, and because that reactivation is, in a way, the Andromedan account describes, but does not fully explain technically, contagious. The reactivation of the consciousness interface function in one human being creates a kind of template, a resonance, that makes reactivation easier for other human beings in proximity. This understanding of individual conscious development as a genuinely collective contribution is one of the most important practical messages of the Andromedan tradition. It is not a call for withdrawal from the world into private spiritual practice. It is a recognition that the most private and personal act of genuine inner development is simultaneously one of the most powerful contributions to the collective transformation that humanity urgently needs. The two are not in tension. They are the same thing understood at different scales. The other dimension of the genetic story that the Andromedan account addresses is the ongoing program of genetic sampling and study that multiple contact traditions describe as a component of what is happening during close encounter events. This aspect of the extraterrestrial contact phenomenon, the reports of medical procedures, tissue sampling, reproductive interventions, and genetic examination that constitute some of the most disturbing elements of contact testimony, is addressed in the Andromedan account with a nuance that is often missing from discussions of this topic. The Andromedan account does not dispute that genetic sampling and study of human beings is occurring. It does dispute the uniformity of the agenda behind it. Multiple different civilizations are described as conducting different kinds of genetic engagement with humanity for different reasons and with different ethical frameworks governing their activity. Some of this genetic engagement in the Andromedan account is conducted by beings aligned with the controlling agenda and is oriented toward the further study and refinement of the suppression program. Some of it is conducted by beings aligned with the council perspective and is oriented toward understanding the current state of the human genome and the progress of the natural reactivation process. And some of it is conducted by beings whose primary agenda is not political at all, but purely scientific. Beings for whom the extraordinary genetic complexity of the human genome represents a subject of research interest comparable to what the most complex biological systems on Earth represent to human biologists. The Andromedan position on genetic engagement with humanity, consistent with the non-interference principle, is that genuinely consensual engagement, whether or not the human being involved is consciously aware of it at the ordinary cognitive level, is fundamentally different from non-consensual engagement, and that the ethical evaluation of any specific instance of genetic encounter must take into account the full context of whether genuine consent, at the level of the consciousness rather than just the ordinary mind, is present. This is a distinction that most human ethical frameworks, which operate at the level of conscious informed consent, are not equipped to make. But it is a distinction that the Andromedan account treats as fundamental to the ethics of interspecies engagement. The genetic story of humanity, in its full Andromedan telling, is simultaneously the story of extraordinary promise deliberately suppressed and extraordinary resilience continuously reasserting itself. The human genome, despite the modifications it has undergone, despite the reduction in its consciousness, interface function carries within it a heritage of biological engineering of the highest order, contributions from multiple advanced civilizations across hundreds of thousands of years, each adding something to a structure of almost incomprehensible complexity. The activation of this full heritage, the restoration of the full bandwidth of the human consciousness interface, is described by the Andromedans not as a transformation that would make humanity unrecognizable to itself, but as a homecoming, a return to what humanity actually is beneath the constraints of the suppression, expressed for the first time in its full, undimmed reality. That homecoming, they apparently say, is what is now becoming possible, not guaranteed, not automatic, but genuinely within reach for a species that chooses to reach for it with everything it has. Secret societies, hidden knowledge, and the Andromedan connection. Throughout the recorded history of human civilization, there have been persistent accounts of groups who claimed access to knowledge not available to the general population. These groups appear across cultures and across centuries, taking different names and different institutional forms, but sharing certain common characteristics: a hierarchical structure of initiation through which deeper knowledge was progressively revealed, a tradition of secrecy about the deeper levels of that knowledge, a claimed lineage tracing their tradition to ancient sources of genuine wisdom, and a practice set oriented toward the development of conscious capability beyond the ordinary human baseline. The history of these groups, commonly referred to as secret societies or mystery schools, is almost impossible to reconstruct with confidence from the outside, precisely because their secrecy was functional rather than theatrical. The most significant knowledge they held was not kept secret primarily to enhance the mystique of membership or to concentrate power, though both of those dynamics certainly operated in various historical instances. The deepest reason for secrecy, in the most authentic versions of these traditions, was the recognition that the knowledge they held was both genuinely powerful and genuinely dangerous in the wrong hands, and that the only effective protection for both the knowledge and its holders was concealment from those who would destroy or corrupt it. The Andromedan account provides a specific framework for understanding this history. The mystery school traditions of the ancient and medieval world were not independent human inventions. They were, in their original and most authentic forms, the vehicles through which the knowledge transmitted from advanced civilizations to early human societies was preserved through periods when direct transmission was not possible. When the open engagement of the earlier period was withdrawn, the knowledge that had been shared during that engagement did not simply disappear. It went underground, carried by lineages of initiated human beings who understood its value and its implications, and who undertook the dangerous responsibility of transmitting it across generations under conditions of increasing hostility from the institutional structures of the controlling agenda. The ancient Egyptian mystery schools represent, in the Andromedan account, one of the most important nodes in this transmission network. The wisdom preserved within the Egyptian initiatory tradition, of which the publicly visible religious practice of ancient Egypt was only the outermost layer, included specific bodies of practical knowledge about the relationship between consciousness and physical reality, about the nature of the non-physical dimensions of existence, about the architecture of the human consciousness system, and the methods by which it could be intentionally developed beyond its ordinary baseline. This knowledge was not entirely derived from indigenous Egyptian spiritual development. A significant portion of it was, in the Andromedan account, directly transmitted from the beings associated with the establishment of the earliest Egyptian civilization, beings whose understanding of consciousness and reality was not metaphysical speculation, but practical knowledge of the kind that any sufficiently advanced civilization acquires through millions of years of direct investigation. The parallels between the preserved fragments of ancient Egyptian initiatory practice and the principles described in the Andromedan contact tradition are striking. The Egyptian concept of the Akh, the luminous or shining aspect of the human being that was understood as the fully integrated self, conscious and capable across multiple dimensions of existence, corresponds closely to what the Andromedan tradition describes as the fully activated human consciousness operating at its designed bandwidth. The Egyptian practices of Sabbat, the disciplines of self-knowledge and ethical refinement that form the foundation of initiatory training, correspond to the individual inner development work that the Andromedan tradition describes as the primary means by which the suppressed consciousness potential can be reactivated. Even the specific symbolism of Egyptian sacred art, the repeated imagery of the eye, of the feather, of the scales, of specific geometric configurations, encodes, in the Andromedan account, specific practical information about the structure and function of the human consciousness system that would be legible to anyone who approached it with the appropriate initiatory training. The transmission of this Egyptian knowledge into subsequent Western civilization occurred through multiple channels, many of them deliberately obscured to prevent their recognition by the institutional powers that sought to suppress them. The Hermetic tradition, named for Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice great Hermes who the Greek-Egyptian syncretism identified as the source of a body of philosophical and practical texts about the nature of reality and the development of consciousness, is described in the Andromedan account as one of the most important surviving vehicles of this transmission. The Hermetic texts, which circulated in various forms through the ancient Mediterranean world, through the Islamic Golden Age, through the Renaissance, and into the modern Western esoteric tradition, preserve genuine fragments of the practical knowledge of consciousness that the earlier direct transmission from advanced civilizations had introduced into human civilization. The core Hermetic principle, the assertion that the universe is fundamentally mental, that consciousness is the primary substance of which physical reality is an expression rather than the reverse, is not merely a philosophical position in the Hermetic tradition. It is presented as a practical foundation for a specific program of conscious development. The understanding that consciousness is primary in the Hermetic framework, as in the Andromedan one, is not merely an interesting metaphysical conclusion. It is the basis for a specific technology of transformation, a set of practices and disciplines oriented toward aligning individual human consciousness with the fundamental nature of reality in ways that expand the range of conscious experience and capability available to the practitioner. The Pythagorean tradition represents another important stream of this transmitted knowledge, this one focused primarily on the mathematical and harmonic dimensions of the understanding that the earlier advanced civilizations had shared with humanity. Pythagoras, whose historical biography is as much legend as documented fact, is described in various ancient sources as having spent extended periods in Egypt and in the East, studying with traditions that preserved the deeper mathematical knowledge of the earlier period. The specific mathematical insights associated with the Pythagorean tradition, including the understanding of musical harmony as a reflection of cosmic mathematical relationships, the investigation of specific geometric forms as encodings of fundamental principles of physical reality, and the development of numerical symbolism as a method for expressing multidimensional relationships that cannot be captured in ordinary language, all reflect in the Andromedan account genuine fragments of the mathematical understanding that the earlier advanced civilizations possessed in much more complete form. The Gnostic tradition of the early Christian era is described in the Andromedan account as representing a particularly sharp and clear articulation of certain aspects of the transmitted knowledge, and a tradition that was correspondingly targeted for the most aggressive suppression by the institutional Christianity that the controlling agenda found far more useful than the genuine Gnostic understanding. The Gnostic description of the cosmos as dominated by a false creator god, the demiurge, who maintains the souls of humanity in a state of ignorance about their true nature and origin, is, in the Andromedan account, not a theological fantasy or a rejection of Jewish monotheism for its own sake. It is a metaphorical but genuinely accurate description of the controlling forces and their strategy of consciousness management that the Gnostic traditions had somehow, through whatever combination of direct transmission and genuine intuition, arrived at with remarkable precision. The Gnostic concept of gnosis itself, the direct experiential knowledge of the nature of reality and of one's own divine origin that the Gnostic traditions placed at the center of the spiritual life, maps precisely onto what the Andromedan tradition describes as the expanded conscious awareness that becomes available when the suppressed human consciousness interface begins to function at higher levels. Gnosis, in the Gnostic understanding, is not belief. It is not faith in any conventional theological sense. It is direct perception, a knowing that bypasses the ordinary cognitive processes and accesses reality at a level more fundamental than the inferential structures of ordinary thought. This is exactly the quality of experience that the Andromedan tradition associates with the reactivation of the suppressed consciousness interface function in the human genome. The persecution and eventual elimination of the Gnostic traditions from mainstream Western civilization, carried out with particular thoroughness by the institutional Catholic Church beginning in the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era and intensifying through the medieval period, is described in the Andromedan account as one of the most significant single acts of knowledge suppression in human history, precisely because the Gnostic traditions were among the clearest available expressions of the core understanding that the controlling forces most needed to prevent from reaching wide human awareness. The burning of Gnostic texts, the persecution of Gnostic communities, the systematic misrepresentation of Gnostic teaching in the official histories produced by the victorious Orthodox tradition, these were not merely the natural consequences of theological competition. They were the targeted elimination of a specific body of knowledge that posed the most direct threat to the maintenance of the consciousness management system that the controlling agenda had established. The survival of fragments of this knowledge into the modern period, through the Hermetic tradition, through certain strands of Jewish mysticism, including Kabbalah, through the Islamic Sufi tradition, through the alchemical tradition of the medieval and Renaissance periods, through the Rosicrucian and Masonic traditions that emerged in the 17th and 18th centuries, is described in the Andromedan account as both an achievement of extraordinary tenacity by the human beings who carried it and evidence that the suppression was never complete. The knowledge survived because it was carried by people who understood its importance and who were willing to accept the personal risks of that stewardship across centuries during which the institutional powers of the controlling agenda made the preservation of such knowledge a life-threatening activity. The Rosicrucian manifestos of the early 17th century, the Fama Fraternitatis and the Confessio Fraternitatis, represent what the Andromedan account describes as a deliberate attempt to bring certain aspects of the preserved knowledge back into European intellectual life at a moment when the cultural conditions created by the Renaissance and the Reformation seemed to offer an opportunity for reception without immediate violent suppression. The Rosicrucian tradition, as it developed from these manifestos, preserved genuine elements of the practical knowledge of consciousness development, embedded within an alchemical and philosophical framework that provided enough surface obscurity to protect it from immediate institutional attack, while still being legible to those with the necessary preparation. The Masonic tradition that emerged in the 18th century is described in the Andromedan account in more ambivalent terms. The original impulse behind the development of speculative Freemasonry, as distinct from the operative stonemasonry guilds from which it claimed descent, was the creation of a formal institutional structure for the preservation and transmission of certain elements of the older initiatory knowledge. This impulse was genuine, and some versions of the Masonic tradition did manage to preserve and transmit genuine elements of the practical consciousness development tradition, but the Masonic institution was also, from an early point in its development, a target for infiltration and redirection by the controlling forces, who recognized the value of co-opting rather than simply suppressing a tradition that had achieved significant social and political influence. The result, as the Andromedan account describes it, is that the Masonic tradition exists in its historical and current forms as a complex mixture, genuine preservations of older wisdom traditions existing alongside deliberate distortions and redirections introduced by the infiltrating agenda. The presence of genuine wisdom elements in the Masonic tradition is one of the reasons it has attracted serious researchers and genuine seekers throughout its history. The simultaneous presence of the distorting elements, which have grown in influence over time, is one of the reasons that the tradition has also attracted, with equal justification, significant criticism and concern. This pattern of infiltration and co-optation, the strategy of gaining control of existing traditions of preserved knowledge, rather than simply suppressing them, is described in the Andromedan account as one of the primary tools of the controlling agenda in the post-medieval period. Outright suppression, while effective for eliminating specific traditions, is visible and generates resistance and martyrdom that can strengthen rather than weaken the suppressed tradition. Co-optation is subtler and ultimately more effective, taking control of the institution that carries the knowledge, gradually introducing distortions that hollow out the genuine content while maintaining the form that attracts seekers, and converting a vehicle of genuine transmission into a vehicle of controlled misdirection. The modern New Age movement, which emerged in the late 20th century as a broad cultural phenomenon incorporating elements of multiple older esoteric traditions, alternative medicine, environmental consciousness, and contact experiences, is described in the Andromedan account as a particularly complex example of this dynamic. The New Age movement contains genuine elements of the transmitted knowledge, fragments of genuine understanding about consciousness and reality that have been important vehicles for the expansion of human awareness about the deeper nature of existence. It also contains, in the Andromedan account, significant elements of deliberate distortion and misdirection, teachings that superficially resemble the genuine knowledge, but that, on closer examination, redirect the seeker's energy toward experiences that feel profound, but that do not produce the genuine development of conscious capability that the authentic tradition is oriented toward. The distinction between genuine development and the simulation of development, between the actual expansion of conscious awareness and the induced states that mimic expansion without producing it, is one of the most important and most difficult discriminations to make within any contemporary spiritual or personal development context. The Andromedan account suggests that this difficulty is not accidental. The proliferation of pathways that mimic the experience of genuine development while failing to produce its actual results is, in their account, a deliberate product of the same forces that have historically worked to suppress authentic understanding of the human consciousness system and its potential. The authentic traditions of consciousness development that survive in the modern world, the genuine elements preserved within the various esoteric and wisdom traditions, the practices that actually produce the development of expanded conscious awareness rather than merely its simulation, share certain common characteristics that the Andromedan tradition identifies. They are grounded in ruthless self-honesty, in the willingness to see one's own consciousness clearly rather than to flatter it. They require genuine discipline and sustained practice rather than the passive reception of experiences. They produce changes in the actual quality and range of conscious awareness rather than merely in the content of beliefs or the intensity of emotional experiences. And they tend to be found in the less institutionally popular, less commercially successful corners of any given tradition, precisely because the qualities they cultivate are not the ones that institutional success in the current cultural climate rewards. The Andromedan account of the mystery school tradition, from ancient Egypt through the modern period, is ultimately a story of remarkable human tenacity in the face of sustained and sophisticated suppression. The fact that any genuine knowledge of the deeper nature of human consciousness and its development potential has survived at all, given the duration and the sophistication of the suppression program, is described by the Andromedans as evidence of something they find genuinely admirable about the human spirit: the persistence of the drive toward genuine understanding, the refusal to be entirely contained by systems of thought control, however sophisticated, the recurring emergence of genuine seekers who find their way to genuine knowledge through whatever cracks remain in the walls built to keep them out. That persistence in the Andromedan account is not coincidental. It reflects the natural operation of the suppressed but not eliminated consciousness interface function in the human genome, the inherent drive of a consciousness system designed for full bandwidth operation to keep pushing toward the expansion of its own experience, even when the biological and cultural conditions work against it. The mystery school tradition, in all its historical complexity, is, at its best, the organized expression of that inherent drive, the human attempt to create conditions under which the push toward genuine understanding can be sustained and transmitted across generations, despite the forces arrayed against it. Understanding this tradition in its genuine core, rather than its distorted institutional expressions, is, in the Andromedan account, one of the important preparations for the kind of conscious engagement that the current period of transformation requires, not because the specific forms of the older traditions are necessarily appropriate for the current moment, which has its own specific characteristics and requirements, but because the understanding of what genuine consciousness development actually involves, grounded in the long human record of what has worked and what has been deliberately made to fail, is essential knowledge for anyone seriously engaging with the possibilities of this historical moment. The secret, in the end, is not a specific piece of information that can be held in the mind and possessed. The secret is a quality of conscious engagement with reality, a willingness to see clearly, to know honestly, to develop genuinely, that cannot be transmitted through any institutional form, however well designed. It can only be lived. And the invitation to live it, extended by the most authentic voices in the human wisdom tradition across the full span of recorded history, is ultimately the same invitation that the Andromedans themselves appear to extend to humanity in the current moment, to become, in full actuality, what you have always had the potential to be. The final transmission, the complete Andromedan message for humanity. We have traveled across the previous 12 sections of this exploration through a vast territory of claim and context, through cosmic history and ancient contact, through genetic manipulation and political conspiracy, through the architecture of cosmic governance, and the suppressed wisdom of the mystery schools. We have followed the Andromedan tradition from its roots in the oldest human cultural memories through to its most contemporary expressions in the contact testimony of modern witnesses. And throughout this journey, we have kept sight of what the tradition itself insists must be kept sight of: that all of this information, all of this historical and cosmological and political context is not the destination. It is the map. The destination is something that cannot be contained in any amount of information, however vast and however accurate. But before we arrive at what the Andromedan tradition describes as that ultimate destination, it is worth pausing to consolidate what has been said across the preceding exploration into its most essential form. The Andromedan message to humanity, stripped of all the historical context and cosmological elaboration, is simple enough to be stated in a few sentences. What makes the full elaboration necessary is not that the simple statement is untrue, but that without the context, it cannot be genuinely understood. It can be received intellectually, filed as an interesting belief, and have no genuine transformative effect whatsoever. With the context, it has the possibility of striking at a level of understanding that is deeper than the intellectual, the level at which genuine change in the quality of conscious experience becomes possible. The simple statement is this: you are not what you have been told you are. Your world is not what it has been presented to be. The situation you are in is not the situation that has been described to you. And the capacity you have to change your situation is not the capacity you have been permitted to know you possess. Every element of the Andromedan contact tradition points toward and elaborates this simple statement. The cosmological framework demonstrates that the universe is fundamentally conscious rather than fundamentally material, which means that consciousness, and specifically the development of conscious awareness, is the most fundamental activity in which any being can engage. The historical account demonstrates that this understanding has been systematically suppressed in human civilization, and that the suppression has been sustained and sophisticated rather than accidental. The political analysis demonstrates that there are forces actively invested in the continuation of this suppression, forces that understand the implications of its ending and that have structured much of human civilization to prevent that ending. And the message of possibility demonstrates that the suppression, for all its duration and sophistication, is neither complete nor permanent, that the human consciousness system retains its inherent drive toward full expression, and that the current historical moment provides an unusual and time-limited window of opportunity for that expression to accelerate beyond any previous period. The Andromedan description of what full human consciousness expression actually looks and feels like, drawn from the most detailed and most consistent aspects of the contact testimony, is worth dwelling on carefully because it is not what most people imagine when they think of human potential. It is not primarily about extraordinary powers or extraordinary experiences. It is not about the ability to move objects with the mind, or to know the future, or to communicate telepathically, or to heal instantly, though the Andromedan account does describe all of these as natural expressions of human consciousness operating at fuller bandwidth. These capabilities, in the Andromedan account, are not the point of conscious development. They are the incidental results of a quality of consciousness that is oriented towards something deeper and more important than any specific capability. What the Andromedan tradition describes as the essential quality of fully developed human consciousness is something that appears simple when stated and is revolutionary in its actual implications. It is the quality of genuine presence, of full, undistorted, undivided awareness of the actual nature of what exists in this moment. Not what memory says exists, not what fear anticipates, not what conditioning has taught us to see, but what actually exists in its full depth and complexity and beauty and difficulty, without the filtering and distorting that the suppressed consciousness system imposes on ordinary experience. This quality of genuine presence is, in the Andromedan account, not a passive state of observation. It is the most active state of being available to a conscious creature. A human consciousness genuinely present to the full reality of what is has access, through the reactivated consciousness interface function, to a range of information about the nature of that reality that the ordinary filtered consciousness cannot receive. It can perceive the energetic dimensions of people and situations that ordinary perception filters out. It can sense the direction of causation, the deep structure of events, in ways that allow responses of qualitatively greater wisdom and effectiveness than the ordinary reactive consciousness produces. It can engage with the consciousness substrate, the non-material foundation of physical reality, in ways that affect physical outcomes through what the Andromedan tradition describes as conscious resonance rather than physical manipulation. These are not supernatural capacities. They are the natural functions of a biological consciousness system operating at its designed level of bandwidth, doing what it was built to do when the suppressions that currently constrain it are lifted. The recovery of these capacities is not the acquisition of something new. It is the recovery of something inherent, the homecoming to what the human system is at its full expression, which has never been permanently lost, but has been systematically prevented from manifesting in most human beings in most historical periods. The Andromedan description of what becomes possible for human civilization when a critical mass of its members begin to operate from this quality of presence is one of the most genuinely hopeful visions in the contact literature, not because it promises a paradise delivered from outside, but because it describes consequences that follow with a kind of logical inevitability from the transformation of the quality of human consciousness itself. A sufficiently large body of genuinely present human consciousness, operating from full bandwidth awareness rather than from the fearful, fragmented, easily manipulated state that the suppression maintains, is not susceptible to the tools that the controlling agenda relies upon. The divisions that are deliberately cultivated cannot take hold in a consciousness that genuinely perceives the interconnection of all life. The false scarcity that drives so much human conflict cannot be maintained in the face of a consciousness that directly perceives the abundance of the consciousness substrate. The hierarchies of dominance and control that have structured human civilization throughout the recorded period cannot be sustained by a consciousness that directly perceives its own inherent worth and the inherent worth of every other conscious being. The political and economic implications of this shift in the quality of human consciousness are, in the Andromedan account, not secondary effects. They are primary outcomes. The natural reorganization of human social structures around the actual quality of human consciousness rather than around the manufactured limitations of the suppressed state. The Andromedans do not describe a specific political or economic system as the correct expression of evolved human civilization. They describe a quality of conscious engagement with the challenges of collective life that produces, through its own inherent wisdom, structures that genuinely serve the flourishing of all members of the community rather than the extraction of value from some by others. The environmental implications are equally direct. A human civilization operating from genuine presence, from direct perception of the consciousness substrate and its relationship to physical life, cannot systematically destroy the biological richness of its planet in the way that the current civilization does, because it perceives, directly and not merely as an intellectual conclusion, the relationship between biological richness and the quality of conscious experience available to beings living within it. The destruction of biodiversity, in the context of expanded conscious awareness, is not merely an environmental problem with practical consequences. It is experienced as the destruction of dimensions of one's own consciousness, as a direct impoverishment of the quality of awareness available to oneself and to all other beings sharing the same world. This direct perception makes the continuation of ecologically destructive practices essentially impossible, not because it creates an intellectual argument against them that reason can evaluate, but because it makes their continuation experientially intolerable in a way that requires no argument and no rational persuasion. The technological implications of expanded human consciousness are described in the Andromedan account as involving a fundamental reorientation of the direction and the priorities of human technological development, away from the extraction and manipulation of physical resources and toward the direct engagement with the consciousness substrate that produces technologies of the kind already described in the section on Andromedan technology itself. The specific technological breakthroughs that the Andromedan account suggests become possible for a humanity whose consciousness interface is functioning at higher levels include the development of genuine zero-point energy technology, the development of communication systems that do not rely on physical carrier waves, the development of healing approaches that operate through the consciousness substrate rather than through chemical or mechanical intervention in biological systems, and the development of propulsion systems that operate through dimensional navigation rather than through the brute force application of thrust. None of these technologies require waiting for a government or a corporation or an academic institution to sanction their development. They require human beings whose consciousness has developed to the point where they can perceive and work with the consciousness substrate in the ways these technologies require. The development of individual human consciousness is, therefore, not merely a personal spiritual project. It is the most important technological research and development project available to the human species at this moment in its history. The Andromedan account of what they themselves will do as human consciousness expands is one of the most precise and most carefully constrained aspects of the tradition. They do not promise dramatic public appearances. They do not promise the delivery of technology or the resolution of specific political or environmental crises. What they describe as their intended response to genuine expansion of human consciousness is an intensification of the contact, a progressive deepening of the communication and collaboration that has been constrained by the non-interference principle as long as humanity's genuine consent and genuine readiness for deeper engagement could not be reliably established. The contact they describe as becoming possible for a humanity that has genuinely chosen expanded awareness is not the dramatic first contact scenario of science fiction, the landing ships, the press conferences, the formal exchange of ambassadors. It is something both more gradual and more profound, a deepening relationship between human consciousness and the broader field of cosmic intelligence that the universe contains, a progressive revelation of the true nature and true history of the human situation, a collaborative engagement with the challenges of this period in which the contributions of both human and non-human intelligence can be brought to bear on problems that neither can resolve alone. They also describe, in the most forward-looking elements of the contact literature, something that has no real precedent in the human experience of extraterrestrial contact, the possibility of genuine creative collaboration between human and Andromedan civilization, the possibility that what humanity contributes to the galactic community when it arrives at the level of development that genuine membership requires will be genuinely new, genuinely unprecedented, genuinely valuable in ways that even the most ancient galactic civilizations have not anticipated. The specific quality of human consciousness, shaped by the extraordinary complexity of its genetic heritage and its unique position at the intersection of multiple civilizational lineages, produces, in the Andromedan account, a form of awareness whose specific character is unlike anything that has previously emerged in this region of the universe. This is not a vague compliment. It is a specific claim about the nature of what human consciousness at full expression actually is. The combination of the natural evolutionary baseline that Earth's biosphere developed, the enhancing modifications introduced by civilizations aligned with the best interests of consciousness development, and even the specific quality of resilience and creativity that the suppression itself has paradoxically cultivated in the human spirit over the long historical period of constraint, has produced something that the Andromedan tradition describes with what can only be interpreted as genuine curiosity and genuine excitement, a form of consciousness that they have not seen before, that brings to the full expression of galactic awareness a quality of perspective, of creative engagement, of what might almost be called spiritual improvisation that their own much longer and much more ordered civilizational tradition has not generated and apparently cannot generate from within itself. This is the ultimate ground of the Andromedan investment in humanity, not charity toward an inferior species, not the paternalistic management of a developing civilization that needs to be kept from hurting itself, but genuine interest, genuine investment in the emergence of something new, a consciousness that can contribute something to the universe's ongoing self-exploration that has not been contributed before, a consciousness that has been forged in the specific crucible of this planet's history. This species' struggles, this civilization's long and painful and ultimately incomplete but persistent reach toward the understanding of its own nature. The Andromedan message, delivered across all the historical and cosmological complexity of the tradition, is ultimately an act of respect. It is the respect of one conscious being for another, the recognition that what the other has, the specific quality of being that emerges from the specific history of its development, is valuable, is real, is worthy of engagement and investment and genuine relationship, not because the one being addressed is perfect or fully developed or already ready for everything that is being offered, but because it has the potential to become all of those things, and because the universe, in the Andromedan understanding, is richer for every form of consciousness that reaches its full expression. The invitation that underlies everything the Andromedan tradition says is not an invitation to believe specific claims or to adopt a specific worldview. It is an invitation to take seriously the possibility that you are more than you have been told, that the world is more than it appears, that the situation is more navigable and more charged with genuine possibility than the voices of limitation and fear suggest, and that the most revolutionary act available to any human being in this moment is the simple, difficult, ongoing commitment to seeing things as they actually are, rather than as the filters of suppressed consciousness present them. That commitment is not a guarantee of anything. It does not promise specific outcomes or specific experiences. It does not promise that the challenges of this period will be navigated successfully, that the transformation they describe will occur on any particular timeline, or that the personal journey of expanded awareness will be anything other than what it is: difficult, disorienting, sometimes lonely, and ultimately the most meaningful and most interesting thing that a conscious being can do with the time and the circumstance of any specific life. What the Andromedans apparently say, across all the complexity of their tradition, is that the journey is worth taking, that what lies on the other side of the suppression, what genuine consciousness at full human expression is and does and sees and creates, is worth every difficulty of the path toward it. And that the universe, far vaster and far more populated with intelligence and awareness and genuine care than the current human understanding perceives, is waiting for humanity with what can only be described in the vocabulary available to us as something like love, not the sentiment, not the emotion, the principle, the fundamental orientation of consciousness toward the flourishing of other consciousness, the recognition of kinship across all difference, the willingness to invest, across any distance of space and time, in the development of what has the potential to contribute something irreplaceable to the great conversation that the universe is having with itself through the medium of the beings it contains. That is the Andromedan message, not a threat, not a rescue, a conversation, a relationship, an invitation to show up fully and honestly in a universe that has been paying attention to this species for far longer than this species has known. The showing up is the only thing that is asked. Everything else that matters follows from that. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. I love hearing from you. Check out more videos on the screen, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.